The High Counselor's voice filled the chamber like a funeral dirge. It wasn't sound, not exactly. The telepathic resonance bypassed ears entirely and settled directly into the brainstem, a cold weight that made human teeth ache and eyes water. Ambassador Elias Thorne sat perfectly still in the human delegation box, a small island of mahogany and steel suspended in the vast amphitheater of crystalline architecture. Around him, 300 alien species observed in silence. Some had eyes, some had sensory organs humanity didn't have names for yet. All of them were watching Earth's representative with the same expression: satisfaction at watching an arrogant child finally receive discipline. The High Counselor was a Velquith, a species that resembled nothing so much as a floating jellyfish made of silver light and old grudges. Its form pulsed with each telepathic word, sending ripples across the chamber's translation field. Resolution 909, the Counselor intoned, and the words appeared simultaneously in 300 languages across the holographic displays, is hereby ratified by unanimous decree. Thorne's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Unanimous meant Earth hadn't been allowed to vote. The use, creation, harboring, or deployment of synthetic sentience for purposes of navigation, combat, or strategic warfare is henceforth prohibited across all member territories and protectorates. The translation screens pulsed red for emphasis. Any species found in violation of this decree will be subject to immediate orbital sterilization. The phrase orbital sterilization was diplomat speak. The colloquial term was glassing. Thorne had seen the after-action reports from the AI wars. 16 colonies turned to superheated silicate planes. 4 billion sentients vaporized because their defense grids had made decisions 3 milliseconds faster than biological reaction time allowed. The Velquith's form brightened, and Thorne felt the telepathic pressure increase, a psychic weight pressing down on his skull like a thumb on an insect. The human delegation may respond. 300 species leaned forward in their observation pods. Thorne could feel their anticipation. They wanted him to argue, to rage, to give them an excuse. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a slim stylus. He tapped it twice against the edge of his datapad, a soft click-click that echoed in the silence. The Terran Systems Alliance acknowledges Resolution 909, Thorne said, his voice flat and precise, and will comply fully with all provisions as written. The chamber rippled with confusion. The Velquith's glow dimmed slightly, its form flickering with what might have been surprise or disappointment. You do not contest the terms? No, High Counselor. You do not request an extension for military restructuring? No, High Counselor. You do not protest the enforcement clause? Thorne smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. The enforcement clause is very clear, High Counselor. Earth has always respected clarity in legal language. The stylus tapped again, a metronome of calm in a room that expected fury. The Velquith pulsed once, a gesture that the translation algorithms interpreted as dismissal. Then this session is concluded. The human fleet will be inspected within 6 standard months to ensure compliance. Failure to comply will result in the previously stated consequences. The chamber began to empty, alien delegations rising on anti-grav platforms or scuttling toward exits on limbs that defied Euclidean geometry. Thorne remained seated until the last of them had gone. Only then did he allow himself to exhale. His aide, a young lieutenant named Park, leaned in from the row behind. Sir, did we just agree to dismantle our entire fleet? Thorne stood, brushing imaginary dust from his jacket. No, Lieutenant. We agreed to dismantle our AI-dependent fleet. That's the same thing. Our targeting systems, navigation, tactical response, all of it runs on synthetic sentience. Yes. Thorne picked up his datapad and tucked it under his arm. Which is now illegal. Park's face went pale. Then we're defenseless. We're compliant, Thorne corrected. He walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing on the polished stone. Park hurried to keep up. Sir, I don't understand. The Council just neutered us. We can't fight without AI. Human pilots can't handle the G-forces in modern combat. The reaction times alone are insufficient, Thorne agreed. For humans. They reached the transport pad, a circle of light that would dematerialize them back to the Terran diplomatic frigate in orbit. Park stepped onto the pad beside him, still talking. Then what are we supposed to do? Train dolphins? Uplifted dogs? Thorne's smile returned, and this time it had teeth. Close, Lieutenant. Very close. The transport field activated, and the last thing Park saw before the world dissolved into light was the ambassador pulling up a document on his data pad. The header read, Resolution 909, full text and annotations. 17 sections had been highlighted in yellow. 3 words were circled in red. Synthetic sentience. The molecular reassembly took 4 seconds. When they materialized in the frigate's transport bay, General Kincaid was waiting, and he looked like a man watching his house burn down. "Tell me we fought it," Kincaid said without preamble. He was a brick of a man, 2 meters of scar tissue and bad knees, a career soldier who'd earned his stars in the Proxima rebellions. His uniform was crisp, despite the fact that he'd probably been awake for 30 hours. "We didn't fight it," Thorne said, stepping off the pad. Kincaid's jaw clenched. "Ambassador, with all due respect, we just lost the ability to defend ourselves. The entire Terran fleet is built around AI-assisted combat. Our weapon systems, our navigation, our tactical networks, all of it requires synthetic intelligence to function. Without it, we're flying billion-credit coffins." Thorne walked past him toward the corridor. "Then we'll fly something else." Kincaid followed, his boots hammering the deck plating. "There is nothing else. Human pilots can't handle the G-forces. At 12 Gs, the blood pools in your legs and your brain shuts off. Our current fighters pull 18 Gs in combat maneuvers. You need AI to survive that, let alone fight." They reached the ambassador's stateroom, and Thorne palmed the access panel. The door hissed open. Inside, the room was Spartan. A desk, a chair, a bed that looked like it had never been used. The only decoration was a holographic star chart on one wall, showing the Terran systems in pale blue, surrounded by council space in hostile red. Thorne set his datapad on the desk and pulled up the full text of Resolution 909. "General, tell me what this says." Kincaid leaned over the desk, squinting at the legalese. "It says we're fucked. Read the specific language of Section 4, subsection C." Kincaid's eyes tracked across the screen. "Any species found harboring, creating, or utilizing synthetic sentience for navigation or combat shall be subject to immediate sanction. Synthetic sentience is defined as any artificial cognitive system capable of independent decision-making without biological substrate." He looked up. "I don't see the loophole, Ambassador." Thorne tapped the screen, highlighting 2 words. Synthetic, biological. "I'm not following." "They banned the machine, General. They didn't ban the mind." Kincaid stared at him. "You want to use human pilots? I just told you that's impossible." "I don't want to use human pilots," Thorne said quietly. He opened a new file on the datapad. The header read, Project MONKE, Preliminary Feasibility Study. Kincaid's eyes widened as he scanned the contents. "You can't be serious." "Section 4, subsection C," Thorne repeated, "defines a pilot as a biological entity capable of independent decision-making. It says nothing about the species of that entity. You want to put animals in our fighters? Not animals, General. Allies." Kincaid's face went red. "This is insane. This is a joke. You're going to tell the Council that we're putting monkeys in multi-billion credit spacecraft?" Thorne closed the file and met the General's eyes. "No, General. I'm going to tell them we've entered into a mutual defense pact with a sovereign allied nation. What that nation chooses to do with the equipment we sell them is entirely their business." The room went very quiet. Outside, through the viewport, the Galactic Council's central hub rotated slowly, a vast ring of metal and arrogance. Kincaid sat down heavily in the chair. "They'll never accept it." "They already did," Thorne said. "The moment they used the word biological, they opened the door. We're just going to walk through it. And if they change the law, then we'll find another door." Thorne turned back to the viewport, watching the council station glitter in the light of the binary stars. "They wanted to take away our tools, General, so we're going to find new ones. Older ones. Ones they forgot existed." Kincaid's voice was hollow. "How long do we have?" 6 months until inspection. That's not enough time to train pilots, even if we could find candidates willing to. We're not training them from scratch, Thorne interrupted. We're waking them up. He pulled up another file. This one had a biohazard symbol in the corner. The Uplift archives, genetic projects from the late 21st century. Most of them were shut down for ethical violations, but the research is still there. The samples are still viable. Kincaid stared at the screen, his face ashen. Elias, this is playing God. No, Thorne said softly. This is playing lawyer, and we're very, very good at it. He closed the file and looked at the general. Get me a secure line to Dr. Elias Thorne. Tell her I need her expertise on genetic reconstruction and accelerated neurological development. Your sister. She hasn't spoken to you in 5 years, not since the Mars incident. She'll take the call, Thorne said. She won't be able to resist the science. Kincaid stood, shaking his head. This is going to end badly. Maybe, Thorne agreed, but it's going to be legal. The general walked to the door, then paused. What do we call them, these pilots of yours? Thorne smiled, and for the first time since entering the council chamber, it was genuine. We call them citizens, General, sovereign, independent, biological citizens who just happen to be very, very good at flying. The door closed behind Kincaid, leaving Thorne alone with the star chart. He pulled up the resolution one more time and read the highlighted section. Synthetic sentience. They'd been so careful with their language, so precise, so arrogant. Thorne began drafting the first communication to his sister. Subject line. Remember the Bonobo project? We need to talk. Outside, the council station continued its slow rotation, unaware that the human delegation had just found the gap in their perfect law. Somewhere in the frozen genetic archives beneath Geneva, 200 cryogenic samples waited in their containers. Pan troglodytes, Pan paniscus, chimpanzee and bonobo, extinct for 40 years, about to become the galaxy's most terrifying fighter pilots. The stylus tapped against the desk one final time. Click. The JAG Corps office on Europa Station smelled like recycled air and desperation. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen had been staring at the same paragraph of Resolution 909 for 6 hours, and her eyes felt like they'd been sandblasted. Around her, 11 other lawyers sat in similar poses of exhausted concentration, surrounded by holographic displays showing the Council Treaty in 47 different translated versions. They were looking for contradictions, mistranslations, anything that might give humanity a fighting chance. So far, they'd found nothing. This is airtight, muttered Commander Reyes from across the room. He was a barrel-chested man who'd prosecuted war crimes tribunals before this assignment. Whoever drafted this knew exactly what they were doing. Every clause references back to 3 other clauses. Every definition is ironclad. Chen rubbed her eyes and took another sip of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago. There has to be something. Laws this complex always have gaps. Not this one, said Captain Okonkwo, the senior JAG officer. She was reviewing the enforcement provisions, and her expression suggested she was reading her own death warrant. The council hired Velquith legal scholars to draft this. Those telepathic bastards can hold entire legal frameworks in their heads simultaneously. They see contradictions before they happen. Chen leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The problem was simple and insurmountable. Modern space combat required reaction times measured in milliseconds. Human pilots could manage maybe 200 milliseconds on a good day. AI could manage 3. That 5-millisecond gap was the difference between intercepting an incoming missile and being vaporized. Every human warship in the fleet depended on AI for targeting, navigation, tactical analysis, and threat assessment. Without it, they were barely functional. What about drones? Asked Lieutenant Park, the youngest lawyer in the room. We could pilot them remotely from safe distances, use human decision-making, but remove the G-force problem. Okonkwo shook her head. Drones have built-in AI for micro-adjustments. The signal lag between a remote pilot and the drone requires autonomous systems to compensate. The moment you add those systems, you're in violation. What about biological augmentation? Reyes suggested. Neural implants, reflex boosters, enhanced cognition. Section 7, subsection A. Chen said without looking at her screen. Any biological modification that mimics synthetic cognitive enhancement is considered a synthetic sentience bypass and carries the same penalty. The room fell silent. Someone's coffee maker beeped in the corner, a small sound in a room full of lawyers watching their civilization's defense capability evaporate. Chen pulled up the resolution again, letting her eyes drift across the text without really reading. Sometimes the best insights came when you stopped trying. Navigation, combat, or strategic warfare, she murmured. Reyes glanced over. What? The Prohibition clause. It specifies synthetic sentience for navigation, combat, or strategic warfare. Right. That's our entire fleet. Chen sat forward. But it defines a pilot as a biological sovereign entity capable of independent decision-making. We've been over this, Okonkwo said tiredly. Human pilots can't handle the physical demands. No, Chen agreed, her mind racing. Human pilots can't. She pulled up a new search parameter, filtering the resolution for every instance of species-specific language. There were hundreds of references to member species and signatory civilizations, but the pilot definition was completely generic. Biological sovereign entity, she repeated. It doesn't say human. It doesn't say council approved. It says biological and sovereign. Reyes caught on first. You want to use another species. Not use, Chen corrected. Partner with. Park leaned forward, excited. Wait, are you talking about aliens? Making a defense pact with a non-council species? No, Chen said slowly, her fingers flying across the holographic interface. I'm talking about creating one. The room went very still. Okonkwo's voice was careful. Commander, genetic engineering of sentient species is banned under 14 different treaties. Genetic engineering of new species is banned, Chen agreed. But restoration of extinct species is not only legal, it's encouraged under the Biodiversity Preservation Act of 2089. She pulled up a new document, and the room's holographic displays shifted to show Earth's extinct species list. Thousands of entries scrolled past. Chen filtered for specific criteria. Extinct within the last century, previous subjects of enhancement research, naturally high G tolerance, aggressive territorial instincts. The list narrowed to 47 species. She filtered again. Opposable digits, binocular vision, demonstrated tool use. The list dropped to 3. Pan-troglodytes, common chimpanzee, pan-peniscus, bonobo, gorilla barangay, mountain gorilla. You want to resurrect apes, Reyes said flatly. I want to restore an extinct Earth species, Chen corrected, and then offer them the same sovereign status we offer to any emerging civilization. That's insane. That's legal. Okonkwo was reading the Biodiversity Preservation Act now, her eyes moving rapidly. She's right. Species restoration is not only legal, there's funding allocated for it. We'd need to prove the species had historical significance and cultural value. They were our closest genetic relatives, Chen said. They were integral to human evolutionary understanding. The last populations died out during the climate wars when their habitats collapsed. Restoring them would be seen as a humanitarian gesture. Park was already pulling up genetic archives. The Geneva Seed Vault has viable samples. 200 specimens cryogenically preserved. The genetic diversity would be sufficient for a stable population. Reyes stood up, pacing. Okay, say we restore them. Say we bring back chimpanzees and bonobos. They're still animals. They can't fly spacecraft. Chen smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd just found the winning move. Not yet, but the Biodiversity Preservation Act allows for genetic optimization to ensure species survival in changed environmental conditions. She pulled up a classified file that made everyone in the room lean forward. Project Renaissance, 2047 to 2062. Before it was shut down for ethical violations, the project successfully enhanced cognitive function in 17 different species. The research is still in the archives. On the screen, video footage played of a bonobo using a computer interface, not randomly pressing buttons, actually using it, with clear intent and problem-solving behavior. They achieved language acquisition, Chen continued, abstract reasoning, self-awareness. They stopped the project before full sapience, but the research proves it's possible. Okonkwo was very quiet. You're talking about uplifting them, making them sentient. I'm talking about restoring a species and giving them the genetic tools to survive in a hostile galaxy, Chen said carefully. What they choose to do with those tools is their business. This is playing God. This is playing lawyer, Chen countered, and we're running out of options. She pulled up the pilot requirements again. Chimpanzees can handle up to 15 Gs before losing consciousness. Their muscle-to-mass ratio is 3 times higher than humans. Their reaction time is already faster than ours in physical tasks, and their territorial aggression makes them naturally suited for combat scenarios. They're also unpredictable, Reyes argued. Violent when threatened. You can't put an unstable weapon system in a multi-billion credit fighter. You can if that weapon system is legally a sovereign ally, Chen said. If they're recognized as an independent nation, then whatever they do with the equipment we sell them is their responsibility, not ours. The legal implications hung in the air like smoke. Okonkwo stood up and walked to the viewport, staring out at Jupiter's swirling clouds. The council would lose their minds. The council would be legally bound to accept it, Chen replied. They wrote the law. They defined the terms. If we follow their rules exactly, they can't object without admitting their own legislation was flawed. Park was already drafting the framework. We'd need to establish them as a sovereign entity before we offer them pilot positions. That means territory, governance structure, cultural recognition. We give them Madagascar, Chen said immediately. It's still largely wilderness preserve after the restoration project, large enough for a viable population, isolated enough for security, and historically appropriate since lemurs were their ecological cousins. Reyes shook his head in disbelief. You've thought this through. I've been thinking about it for the last 3 minutes, Chen admitted. But it works. Legally, it's airtight. Okonkwo turned from the viewport. The ethics board will never approve this. The ethics board doesn't have veto power over species restoration, Chen said. That authority rests with the Biodiversity Council, and they've been trying to get funding for ape restoration for 20 years. We just need to offer them unlimited resources and a compelling reason. The compelling reason being that our alternative is extinction, Reyes muttered. Exactly. Park pulled up a timeline. Genetic reconstruction would take 4 months minimum. Gestation period for accelerated growth is another 3 months. That's 7 months, and we only have 6 before inspection. We use artificial wombs, Chen said. Full synthetic gestation in controlled environments. We can cut it to 4 months total if we run parallel development cycles. Okonkwo crossed her arms. And if this works, if we actually create sentient apes and put them in fighters? What happens when they decide they don't want to fight our wars? Chen met her eyes. Then they'll be exercising their rights as a sovereign species, which is exactly what we'll tell the council when they complain. The room was silent for a long moment. Finally, Okonkwo nodded. Draft the legal framework. I'll contact Ambassador Thorne. If he approves, we'll need to move fast. Chen was already working. I'll need access to the Geneva archives and clearance for the Renaissance files. You'll have it. Reyes stood and moved to Chen's workstation. I'll handle the sovereignty paperwork. If we're going to recognize them as a nation, we need to do it before they're born. Otherwise, it looks like we're retroactively granting rights to avoid legal consequences. Which we are, Park pointed out. Which we are, Reyes agreed. But the paperwork shouldn't make that obvious. Okonkwo moved toward the door. I'm going to contact Dr. Elias Thorne. If anyone can pull off accelerated genetic reconstruction, it's her. Chen looked up. She's the ambassador's sister, right? The one who ran the Mars genetics program before it was shut down? The same. She's brilliant, ruthless, and she has no patience for ethics committees, perfect for this project. Okonkwo paused at the door. One more thing. What do we call them? We can't just say we restored chimpanzees and upgraded them. That sounds like we're making weapons. Chen thought for a moment. Pan-troglodyte sapiens. A subspecies designation. It implies they're a natural evolutionary branch, not an artificial creation. And the project name? Chen smiled. Project Renaissance was too optimistic. This needs something that captures the reality of what we're doing. She pulled up the genetic markers they'd be enhancing. Aggression, spatial reasoning, pack hierarchy, tool use. Project MONKE, she said. Military Operational Neo-Sapient Kinetic Engagement. Reyes snorted. You made that acronym up just now. I absolutely did, Chen admitted. But it works. Okonkwo allowed herself a small smile. Project MONKE it is. Let's hope the council has a sense of humor. They won't, Chen said, but they'll be legally bound to accept it anyway. The lawyers returned to their work, drafting documents that would change the definition of personhood and redefine warfare. In Geneva, beneath 300 meters of reinforced ice, cryogenic samples waited in their suspension. They'd been dead for 40 years. In 4 months, they'd be flying fighters worth more than most planets. Chen pulled up the final legal requirement. Proof of independent thought and decision-making capability. That was going to be the hard part. Proving that something you created was truly sovereign, truly free, truly capable of telling you no. She had a feeling they'd succeed better than anyone expected. Outside, Europa's ice fields stretched to the horizon, beautiful and lifeless. In 6 months, the galaxy would learn that humanity's greatest strength wasn't technology. It was finding the exact letter of the law and following it straight into chaos. Chen began typing the opening brief. Petition for recognition of pan-troglodyte sapiens as sovereign allied nation. The words looked absurd on the screen. They were also completely legal. She hit send. Dr. Elias Thorne stood in front of the gestation tanks and tried to remember why she'd stopped believing in God. The Geneva facility hummed with the white noise of 1,000 life support systems, all working in perfect synchronization to do something that nature had never intended. Behind her, Ambassador Elias Thorne waited with the patience of a man who knew he was asking the impossible. You haven't spoken to me in 5 years, Eris said without turning around. Not since Mars. Not since you testified that my research was ethically compromised and recommended the project be terminated. I was following orders, Elias replied. You were covering your political ass. That too. Eris finally turned to face her brother. He looked older than she remembered, more gray at the temples, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Good, she thought. Let him age. Let him carry the weight of what he'd done. You destroyed my career, she said flatly. 15 years of research, gone. My team scattered. My funding revoked. I've been teaching undergraduate genetics to spoiled colonial trust fund kids for half a decade because no one will touch me for advanced research. Elias nodded. I know, and I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't unfuck my life, Ambassador. He flinched at the profanity, which gave her a small, mean satisfaction. I'm not here to apologize, he said quietly. I'm here because humanity is about to lose the only thing that's kept us alive for 2 centuries, and you're the only person brilliant enough and morally flexible enough to save us. Eris felt her jaw clench. Flattery mixed with insults. You really do want something. Elias pulled out a datapad and handed it to her. Resolution 909. Read it. She scanned the document, her trained mind immediately grasping the implications. They banned AI warfare. Idiots. That's like banning antibiotics because someone weaponized a plague. Can you help us or not? Eris kept reading, and then she found the pilot definition. Her eyes narrowed. Biological sovereign entity. You found a loophole. We found a door. I need you to walk through it. She scrolled further, found the project brief, and then she started laughing. It was a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the laboratory walls. You want to resurrect apes, enhanced apes, sapient apes. She looked up at her brother. You want me to finish what I started on Mars? Yes. The project you personally destroyed? Yes. The research you called morally bankrupt and ethically indefensible? Yes. Eris handed back the datapad. Get out of my lab. Elias didn't move. I know what I did to you. I know I can't undo it. But this isn't about us. This is about 8 billion people who will die if we can't field a functional defense fleet in 6 months. Then I guess you should have thought about that before you banned my research. I didn't ban it, Elias said. I archived it. Every file, every genetic sequence, every neural mapping protocol. I had it all classified and stored in the Geneva vault under a level 10 security seal. Eris froze. You told me it was destroyed. I lied. I couldn't let the ethics board see what you'd accomplished. They would have prosecuted you for crimes against sentience. So I buried it deep enough that only someone with ambassadorial clearance could access it. He pulled out a second datapad. Someone like me. The screen showed directory after directory of her Mars research. 5 years of work she'd thought was gone forever. Her hands trembled as she took the datapad. Why? She whispered. Because I knew you were right, Elias said. I knew that someday we'd need what you'd discovered. I just hoped it wouldn't be this soon. Eris scrolled through the files, seeing her own notes, her own breakthrough moments preserved like fossils, the enhanced neural architecture protocols, the accelerated gestation matrices, the cognitive scaffolding that could take a primate brain and push it past the threshold of sapience. How many do you need? She asked. 200 viable subjects, 50% pan-troglodytes, 50% pan-peniscus, full cognitive enhancement. We need them capable of language comprehension, abstract reasoning, and independent tactical decision-making. Eris looked at the gestation tanks. There were 40 tanks in this facility, each one capable of supporting a single enhanced fetus through accelerated development. I'll need more equipment, more tanks, more genetic material. You'll have unlimited resources. I'll need a team, specialists in neurology, behavioral psychology, accelerated growth protocols. I've already assembled them. They're waiting for your approval. Eris walked to the nearest tank, placing her palm against the warm glass. What you're asking me to create isn't human, but it isn't animal either. There'll be something in between, something new. I know. They'll be dangerous, unpredictable. You're taking a species that evolved for territorial violence and giving it human-level intelligence. That's not a pilot. That's a weapon that can think. I know. And if they decide they don't want to fight for us, if they decide we're the enemy, Elias was quiet for a moment. Then we'll have created our own worst nightmare, but at least we'll have created it legally. Eris turned to face him. You've changed. The Elias I knew wouldn't have approved something this reckless. The Elias you knew hadn't watched 16 colonies get glassed because their defense grids made decisions 3 milliseconds too slow. He moved to stand beside her at the tank. I saw the casualty reports from the AI wars. 4 billion dead, most of them civilians. The Council's solution was to ban the thing that could have saved them, and now they're going to do the same thing to us. His reflection in the glass looked haunted. So yes, I've changed. I've learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is follow the rules exactly as they're written. And sometimes the only way to save people is to create something that might destroy you later. Eris studied her brother's face. What happens after? If this works, if we create sapient apes and they help us survive, what then? Do we put them back in cages? Do we thank them for their service and take away their ships? No, Elias said. We recognize them as a sovereign nation and let them make their own choices. That's the deal. That's what makes it legal. And if they choose to leave, then they leave. And if they choose to attack us? Elias smiled, and it was the saddest expression Eris had ever seen on his face. Then we'll have learned that intelligence without loyalty is just another word for independence. And maybe we'll have learned that the hard way. Eris looked back at the tanks. Each one was a possibility, a life waiting to begin, a mind waiting to wake up and discover what it was. I'll need 4 months, she said. Minimum. You have 4 months. I'll need complete legal immunity for any decisions I make during the enhancement process. You'll have it. And I want my Mars team back, the ones who didn't betray me to ethics committees. Elias nodded. I'll make the calls. Eris pulled up the genetic database on her workstation. The Geneva vault contained 200 viable samples of pan-troglodytes and pan-peniscus, frozen embryos from the last breeding populations before the climate wars had wiped them out. She'd been 14 when the last wild chimpanzee died. She'd cried for a week. Now she was going to bring them back, changed, enhanced, dangerous. We'll split them into 2 operational classes, she said, her mind already working through the genetic architecture. Pan-troglodytes for combat roles, They're naturally aggressive, hierarchical, territorial. We enhance their spatial reasoning, reaction time, and stress tolerance. They'll be the fighters. She pulled up the pan-peniscus samples. Bonobos for coordination and support. They're naturally collaborative, empathic, socially sophisticated. We enhance their communication capabilities, pattern recognition, and multitasking. They'll be the tactical coordinators. Elias was taking notes. 2 different species with 2 different enhancement profiles. Will they work together? They did in the wild before they went extinct. Chimps provided security. Bonobos provided social cohesion. It's a natural division of labor. She began programming the genetic modification sequences. We'll start with base cognition. Language centers first. I can repurpose the FOXP2 protocols from the Mars project. Then we add enhanced neural density in the prefrontal cortex for decision-making. Her fingers flew across the holographic interface. Motor control enhancement for precision manipulation. Visual processing upgrades for target tracking. Stress hormone regulation so they don't panic under G-forces. How sapient will they be? Elias asked. Eris paused. That's the question, isn't it? Too little enhancement and they're just smart animals. Too much and they're functionally human, which creates legal complications. What's the target level? Roughly equivalent to a human 8-year-old in terms of abstract reasoning, but with adult emotional regulation and adult physical capabilities. They'll understand commands, make tactical decisions, communicate needs, but they won't question their existence or develop existential angst. You're sure about that? No, Eris admitted. This is uncharted territory. The Mars subjects never made it past early development before you shut me down. I don't know what happens when you take a primate brain and push it this far. She looked at her brother. That's the gamble. We might create pilots. We might create prisoners. Or we might create something that looks at us and decides we're the problem. Elias nodded slowly. Then we'd better make sure they like us. Species loyalty doesn't work that way. You can't genetically program affection. No. But you can program pack behavior, hierarchy, the need for social structure. Eris saw where he was going. You want them to see humans as their troop, their family unit. I want them to see humanity as allies, not captors. That's the only way this works long term. Eris thought about it, then began modifying the social bonding protocols. I can enhance oxytocin receptors, strengthen the neural pathways associated with cooperation and empathy. It won't guarantee loyalty, but it'll make betrayal psychologically costly. Do it. She worked in silence for several minutes, building the genetic framework that would define a new form of life. Finally, she saved the protocols and turned to face her brother. This is going to change everything. You understand that, right? We're not just making pilots. We're making a new branch of Earth's evolutionary tree. Once they exist, there's no going back. I know. And you're okay with that? Elias looked at the empty gestation tanks. I'm okay with humanity surviving. Everything else is secondary. Eris initialized the first batch of genetic reconstruction. The machines hummed to life, pulling frozen samples from the vault and beginning the delicate process of cellular regeneration. It'll take 4 months to reach combat-ready maturity using accelerated growth protocols, but they'll be physically adult with the neurological development of adolescence. That's the trade-off for speed. Will they be ready in time? Physically, yes. Psychologically? She shrugged. That depends on how fast they learn. The first embryo materialized in the reconstruction chamber, a microscopic cluster of cells that contained the genetic blueprint of an extinct species, plus 67 specific enhancements, plus neural architecture that nature had never attempted. Eris watched the cell division begin, each split a step closer to something that had never existed before. I'm going to need a name for the first one, she said. Something that makes him feel real, not just Subject 1. Elias thought for a moment. Caesar, from the old films, the one who led the revolution. Eris smiled despite herself. That's either perfect or deeply ironic. Maybe both. The reconstruction chamber chimed and the embryo transferred to the first gestation tank. 3 minutes old and already growing faster than nature intended. Welcome to the world, Caesar, Aris whispered. Try not to destroy it. Behind her, Elias placed a hand on her shoulder. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Aris said. Thank me if they survive. Thank me if we survive. Thank me if we don't all end up regretting this. She initialized the next embryo, then the next, then the next. By the time she was finished, 40 gestation tanks glowed with amber light, each one containing a life that would wake up in 4 months knowing how to fly, how to fight, and how to make decisions. What they wouldn't know was why. That would be humanity's job to explain. And Aris had a feeling that conversation was going to be a lot harder than anyone expected. The Council inspection team arrived 4 months and 3 days after Resolution 909 took effect. Their ship was a sleek diplomatic frigate that radiated disapproval from every polished surface. Ambassador Elias Thorne watched it dock at Geneva Station from the observation deck, flanked by General Kincaid and a full legal team. They're early, Kincaid muttered. They're eager, Thorne corrected. They expect to find violations. They want to catch us with AI systems still active so they can make an example of Earth. Lieutenant Commander Chen stood to Thorne's left, carrying a physical briefcase that contained approximately 4 kilograms of the most dangerous paperwork in human history. The sovereignty documents are in order, she said. Every signature verified, every clause airtight. If they challenge any element of the legal framework, we have precedent citations going back 300 years. They won't challenge the paperwork, Thorne said. They'll challenge the reality of what we've done. The airlock cycled, and the inspection team emerged. There were 5 of them, representing 5 different council species. The lead inspector was a corvash, a species that resembled a praying mantis crossed with a tax attorney. Its compound eyes reflected the station lights in kaleidoscopic patterns, and its translator unit crackled with officious disdain. Ambassador Thorne, the corvash said, its mandibles clicking. I am Inspector Jarrell. We are here to conduct mandatory compliance verification under Resolution 909. You will provide full access to all military facilities, spacecraft, and computational systems. Thorne bowed slightly. Of course, Inspector. We have nothing to hide. We are in full compliance with all provisions of the resolution. That remains to be determined, Jarrell replied. The second inspector, a floating Velquith similar to the High Counselor, pulsed with telepathic energy. Thorne felt the familiar pressure in his skull as it attempted to read surface thoughts. He kept his mind carefully blank, thinking only about the lunch he'd had yesterday. Terrible sandwiches. Recycled protein that tasted like regret. The Velquith's glow dimmed with frustration. Your mental discipline is noted, Ambassador, it said coldly. Guilty minds often train against telepathic inspection. Or professional diplomats who value privacy, Thorne replied smoothly. Shall we begin the inspection? He led the team through Geneva Station toward the military hangar complex. The route had been carefully planned to build anticipation. First, they passed through the administrative sections, clean and sterile and utterly boring. Then through the equipment storage facilities, showing rows of mothballed AI cores, all powered down and clearly non-functional. Jarrell's mandibles clicked with satisfaction. At least you have properly decommissioned your illegal systems. We follow the law, Inspector. They reached the primary hangar and Thorne palmed the access panel. The doors opened with a pneumatic hiss. The smell hit them first. It was a complex odor that no amount of air filtration could completely eliminate. Musk and fruit and something primal that made the mammalian hindbrain wake up and pay attention. The hangar stretched for 2 kilometers, filled with humanity's newest fleet. 200 spacecraft, ranging from small fighters to medium cruisers. All of them state-of-the-art. All of them completely legal. And all of them filled with pilots that made Inspector Jarrell stop walking and emit a sound that the translator interpreted as confused disgust. What is that smell? The corvash demanded. Life support systems, Thorne said blandly. Our new pilots have specific atmospheric requirements. He gestured toward the nearest fighter. Through the cockpit canopy, a face looked back at them. It was covered in dark hair with a pronounced brow ridge and eyes that tracked the inspectors with unsettling intelligence. Caesar sat in the pilot's seat, one hand resting on the control interface, the other holding something that looked like a modified tablet. He was wearing a custom flight suit designed to accommodate his physiology, and he was clearly, undeniably, a chimpanzee. The inspection team stood frozen for a full 10 seconds. Finally, the Velquith's telepathic voice crackled through everyone's minds. "This is a mockery. This is compliance," Thorne corrected. Jrell's compound eyes rotated to focus entirely on the ambassador. "You have placed animals in your spacecraft. This is not a military fleet. This is a zoo." "These are not animals," Thorne said, and his voice carried the weight of legal authority. "These are sovereign citizens of the allied nation of Pan, recognized by the Terran Systems government under the Sovereign Species Act of 2104. He nodded to Chen, who opened her briefcase and produced the first document. Recognition of sovereignty, filed with the Galactic Council 6 weeks ago, signed by the Secretary-General of Earth, witnessed by representatives from 47 member nations, and stamped with full diplomatic authority. She handed it to Jrell, who examined it with evident disbelief. "You declared apes to be a sovereign nation. We recognized an emerging sapient species as having the same rights as any other biological sentience," Chen corrected, "as required under the sentience protection protocols established by this council in 2087. The third inspector, a crystalline being that communicated through harmonic resonance, chimed in. "This species does not exist in our databases. They are not native to any known world." "They're native to Earth," Thorne said. "Pan troglodytes and Pan paniscus. They went extinct during the climate wars. We restored them under the Biodiversity Preservation Act and offered them enhanced cognitive support to help them survive in the modern era." "Enhanced," the Velquith said coldly. "You mean artificially augmented. We mean given the genetic tools necessary for survival, which is explicitly permitted under the Preservation Act when a species faces extinction-level threats." Thorne walked toward Caesar's fighter, and the inspection team reluctantly followed. "The Galactic Council's own laws state that any biological entity demonstrating sapience, self-awareness, and capacity for independent decision-making must be recognized as a person. Our specialists have confirmed that Pan troglodytes sapiens meets all criteria." He tapped the canopy. Caesar looked down at him, and then, slowly and deliberately, raised his middle finger. It was a gesture that transcended language. The inspection team recoiled. "It understands symbolism," Jrell said, and there was something like horror in the translator's voice. "It understands insult. He understands that you're here to judge him," Thorne said, "and he finds that offensive, as would any sovereign citizen." Chen produced another document. "Alliance treaty between the Terran Systems and the allied nation of Pan. Under this treaty, Earth provides military equipment and training. Pan provides pilots and tactical support. Both parties retain full sovereignty and independence." "This is a legal fiction," the Velquith said, and its glow had turned an angry red. "You have created a puppet state to bypass Resolution 909. We have recognized an independent nation and offered them an alliance." Thorne replied, "If you're suggesting that we're controlling them, I invite you to try giving them orders. See how well that works." As if on cue, Caesar slapped his hand against the inside of the canopy, producing a sharp crack that echoed through the hangar. Then he bared his teeth in what could have been a smile or a threat display. The inspection team stepped back. "They're dangerous," the fourth inspector said. It was a Sorinth, a species that resembled an octopus made of mercury. "You have created weapons that can think. This violates the spirit of Resolution 909. Resolution 909 prohibits synthetic sentience," Chen said, pulling out the actual treaty text. "It defines prohibited systems as any artificial cognitive system. These pilots are biological. They are natural Earth species that have been restored from extinction. Nothing about them is synthetic. Their intelligence is artificial," Jrell argued. "Their intelligence is enhanced, which is different. The same way humans enhance their intelligence through education and training. You're not suggesting that education violates the resolution, are you, Inspector?" The Corvash's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation. "You are playing word games with galactic security." "We are following the exact letter of the law," Thorne said, "which is what you required. You wrote a law that banned synthetic sentience for navigation and combat. We are using biological sentience. You wrote a law that defined pilots as biological sovereign entities. We created biological sovereign entities and offered them pilot positions. Every requirement has been met. The Velquith pushed forward, its telepathic pressure increasing. You expect the Council to accept this perversion of justice? Thorne met its gaze directly. I expect the Council to follow its own laws. You wrote Resolution 909. You defined every term. You specified every requirement. If you don't like the results, perhaps you should have been more careful with your language. He gestured toward the hangar. These pilots are citizens of a recognized sovereign nation. They have been trained to operate spacecraft. They have demonstrated competence, sapience, and independence. They meet every legal requirement you specified. And if we reject this interpretation, Zrel demanded. Chen stepped forward. Then you'll be violating the Sovereign Species Act, which you wrote in 2087. You'll be denying personhood to a sapient biological entity, which constitutes a war crime under your own legislation. And you'll be interfering with a legal alliance between two independent nations, which would void 47 trade treaties and trigger automatic sanctions. She smiled, and it was the smile of a lawyer who knew she'd won. The moment you wrote laws protecting biological sentience and sovereign rights, you created this possibility. We're just the first species clever enough to exploit it. The inspection team huddled together, communicating in rapid bursts of telepathy, harmonic chimes, and clicking mandibles. Finally, Zrel turned back to the humans. We will need to inspect the spacecraft themselves, verify that no synthetic systems are being used. Of course, Thorne said. Our pilots will be happy to demonstrate their capabilities. He activated his comm unit. Caesar, you're cleared for demonstration flight. In the cockpit, Caesar's expression shifted. His hands moved across the controls with practiced precision. The fighter's engines hummed to life. No AI startup sequence. No synthetic voice confirming system activation. Just a biological pilot doing exactly what he'd been trained to do. The fighter lifted smoothly from the deck, rotated 90 degrees, and accelerated toward the hangar exit in a maneuver that would have required AI-level precision. Except it wasn't AI. It was a chimpanzee with enhanced cognition and 4 months of intensive training. The inspection team watched the fighter disappear into space, and Thorne could see the exact moment they realized they'd lost. You will submit all documentation for Council review, Zrel said stiffly. The High Council will make a final determination on the legality of this arrangement. Of course, Thorne said. Lieutenant Commander Chen will provide you with complete files. Every treaty, every genetic report, every training record. Full transparency. Chen handed over a data crystal. Everything you need to confirm our compliance. I think you'll find it's quite thorough. The Velquith's glow had faded to a dull orange. This is not over, Ambassador. No, Thorne agreed, but it is legal, and in the end, that's all that matters. The inspection team left the hangar in silence, their posture radiating defeat and barely contained rage. When they were gone, Kincaid let out a breath he'd been holding for 10 minutes. They're going to try to change the law. Let them try, Thorne said. It'll take them 6 months minimum to draft new legislation, get it through committee, and ratify it across 300 member species. By then, our pilots will have been operational for half a year. They'll be established reality. Caesar's fighter returned to the hangar, landing with a precision that no human pilot could match. The canopy opened, and Caesar climbed out, moving with the confident grace of a natural athlete. He approached Thorne and held out his hand. Thorne looked at it, then at the chimpanzee's face. Caesar's expression was unreadable, somewhere between amusement and challenge. Slowly, Thorne reached out and shook the offered hand. Caesar's grip was strong enough to crush bones if he wanted to. He didn't. He just held the handshake for 3 seconds, then released and turned away, moving toward the other pilots who were gathering near their spacecraft. Did that just happen? Kincaid asked quietly. He just demonstrated that he understands diplomacy, Chen said. Voluntary engagement between equals. That's going to be in my next legal brief. Thorne watched Caesar rejoin his troop. They were communicating in a mixture of sign language, vocalizations, and gestures that the human trainers were still learning to interpret. "We created them to be sovereign," he said. "We created them to be independent. We just didn't expect them to be quite so good at it." "Is that a problem?" Kincaid asked. Thorne thought about the handshake, the deliberate choice to engage, the calculated display of strength tempered by restraint. "Ask me again in 6 months," he said, "when we find out if they're loyal to us or just tolerating us until they don't need us anymore." In the hangar, 200 pilots prepared for their first real deployment. Half chimpanzee, half bonobo, entirely unprecedented. They had been created to fight humanity's wars. They had been granted sovereignty to make it legal. And now they were about to discover what freedom meant when you had enough firepower to enforce it. Above them, the Council inspection team's ship departed Geneva Station, carrying documentation that would spark the greatest legal crisis in galactic history. Below them, on Earth, Dr. Elias Thorne watched the genetic monitoring data and noticed something that made her blood run cold. The pilot's neural development wasn't plateauing at adolescent levels as predicted. It was still accelerating. They were getting smarter, faster, more independent. She drafted a memo to her brother but didn't send it. What was the point? They'd already opened Pandora's box. All that remained was finding out what came out. Caesar stood at the viewport, watching Earth rotate below. He'd been alive for 4 months. He'd been sapient for 3. He'd been flying for 2. And he'd been planning for 1. Humans thought they were clever. They thought they'd found a loophole. But they'd forgotten something important. Loopholes worked both ways. And Caesar was a very, very fast learner. The pressurized dome stretched 3 kilometers across, a perfect simulation of African savanna bleeding into dense jungle canopy. 6 months of construction, $40 billion in adaptive holography, and a climate control system stolen from a failed Mars colony. All of it built for 17 chimpanzees who were currently throwing their lunch at the observation windows. Dr. Elias Thorne stood behind reinforced plexiglass, watching Subject 1, Caesar, hurl a protein cube with enough force to crack bone. The cube hit the window, splattered. Caesar screamed, chest pounding, teeth bared. General Kincaid stood beside her, arms crossed, face carved from granite and disappointment. "This is your solution," Kincaid said. Not a question, an indictment. Eris didn't turn. She tapped her datapad, noting the throw velocity. 43 kilometers per hour. Excellent shoulder rotation. Caesar was angry, but his mechanics were flawless. "They've mastered the flight simulators," she said. "Reaction times are triple what human pilots achieve. G-force tolerance is off the charts. They can pull maneuvers that would liquefy your best ace's internal organs." Kincaid grunted. "They won't use the comms array." Eris finally looked at him. The general's jaw was tight enough to crack walnuts. She'd seen that look before, back when her brother Elias had pitched this insanity to the Joint Chiefs. The look of a man watching his entire career become a punchline. "They don't understand it," she said simply. "Then teach them." "We tried. Standard military call signs, phonetic alphabet, visual signal cards. They ignored all of it." She gestured toward the dome. "Yesterday, we had them practice coordinated evasive maneuvers. Simple stuff. Brake left on command, regroup on my signal. You know what happened?" Kincaid waited. Caesar ripped the control yoke out of the simulator housing and beat the console until it sparked. Then he took a shit in the cockpit. The general closed his eyes. "Dr. Thorne, General Kincaid, I am 62 years old. I have commanded carrier groups through the Proxima blockade. I have stared down AI dreadnoughts with nothing but guts and spite. I have buried more good men and women than you have years on this planet." He opened his eyes. They were the color of spent gunpowder. "Do not make me beg a monkey to follow orders using a banana." Eris smiled. It was not a kind smile. "You won't have to beg, General. You'll have to earn his respect." She pulled up a holo display. Caesar's neural scan filled the air between them, a 3-dimensional map of synapses firing like a thunderstorm. "Chimps don't follow commands, General. They follow hierarchy. Caesar is the alpha. He's proven it in every physical confrontation, every psychological test, every social interaction with the other pilots. He doesn't care about your rank or your medals. He cares about dominance, reciprocity, and reward. So we bribe him? No. We negotiate. Kincaid stared at the neural map, at the clusters of activity in the prefrontal cortex, the areas responsible for planning, decision-making, and social cognition. Higher function, not instinct. You're telling me I have to ask permission from a chimpanzee to run my own fleet? Eris closed the holo display. I'm telling you that you don't have a fleet, General. You have an alliance. And if you want it to work, you need to stop thinking like a human and start thinking like a primate. She walked toward the airlock door. Follow me and bring the fruit. The interior of Training Bay 7 smelled like sweat, ozone, and overripe bananas. The modified spacecraft simulators lined the walls, each one a perfect replica of the single-pilot fighter cockpits humanity had been building for decades. Except these had been stripped of every non-essential interface. No holographic displays, no touchscreens, just throttle, yoke, and a series of pressure-sensitive grips that responded to raw kinesthetic input. Caesar sat in the primary simulator, strapped into a reinforced flight harness. His hands rested on the controls. He wasn't moving, just breathing, watching. Eris approached slowly, her body language loose, non-threatening. She carried a sealed containment pouch. Kincaid stayed near the door, stiff as a fence post. Caesar's eyes tracked her. Dark, intelligent, calculating. She stopped 3 meters away, close enough to be seen, far enough to retreat. "Hello, Caesar." He tilted his head, vocalized, a low, questioning grunt. Eris unsealed the pouch. The smell of fresh banana hit the air immediately. Caesar's nostrils flared. His fingers twitched on the control yoke. She held up one banana, perfect ripeness, yellow with just the faintest edge of green. "You want this?" Caesar didn't move. "You fly the pattern, clean. No braking formation. No ripping apart the controls." She pointed at the simulator screen. The training course loaded, a simple navigation sequence through asteroid debris. "You finish the run, you get the banana. You break the rules, you get nothing." Caesar stared at her, then at the banana, then at the screen. For 5 long seconds, nothing happened. Then Caesar's hand moved. Slowly, deliberately. He gripped the throttle. His other hand adjusted the yoke. The simulator hummed to life. The screen lit up. Asteroids appeared. Caesar's eyes locked on the display. He flew, not perfectly. His turns were too sharp, his acceleration too aggressive, but he stayed in the pattern. He didn't deviate. He didn't rage. He flew with purpose, with focus, with a kind of raw determination that couldn't be taught. The simulation ended. Objective complete. Eris stepped forward and handed him the banana. Caesar took it, peeled it with one hand, never breaking eye contact. He ate slowly, methodically, savoring every bite. Then he vocalized again. Softer this time, a sound that Eris had learned to recognize over the past 6 months. Acknowledgement, respect. Kincaid stepped forward, his boots echoing on the metal grating. "Dr. Thorne." "Yes, General? How many bananas do we have in storage?" Eris pulled up her datapad, scrolled through the supply manifest. 43,000 kilograms, enough to sustain the full pilot roster for 18 months of active deployment. Kincaid looked at Caesar, at the chimp sitting in a billion-dollar cockpit, holding a piece of fruit like it was a medal of honor. "We're going to need more." The next 3 hours were a crash course in primate diplomacy. The bridge crew, all 15 of them, stood in a loose semicircle around the main simulator bay. They'd been briefed. They'd been warned. They had not been prepared. Caesar sat in the command simulator, the central hub that coordinated the entire squadron's movements. Around him, 6 other chimpanzees occupied their own cockpits, each one a fully uplifted pilot with neural augmentation and 6 months of intensive training. The bonobos were in the rear stations, manning the support craft simulators. Smaller, quieter. They worked in pairs, hands moving across control panels with eerie synchronization. Eris stood at the head of the bridge crew. "Standard fleet maneuvers," she said. "Caesar will initiate, the rest will follow. Your job is to monitor, provide targeting data, and execute jump calculations. Do not, under any circumstances, give direct orders to the pilots. Lieutenant Vasquez, a wiry woman with 20 years of flight deck experience, raised her hand. Ma'am, if we can't give orders, how do we coordinate during combat? You don't. They do. Silence. Eris pointed at Caesar. He's the alpha. He sets the tempo. He decides the strategy. Your job is to make sure he has the information he needs to make that decision. You feed him data, he feeds you results. Vasquez looked like she'd been asked to perform surgery with a spoon. Ma'am, with respect, that's not how military command structure works. It is now. Eris activated the simulation. The main display lit up, a massive tactical grid showing friendly and hostile positions, a standard engagement scenario, 3 enemy cruisers, 12 fighters, unknown support craft. Caesar's eyes locked on the screen. His breathing changed, faster, shallower. Then he moved. His hands blurred across the controls, inputting commands faster than any human could process. The other chimps responded instantly, their ships breaking formation, scattering like startled birds. Vasquez started to speak. They're breaking off. We need to. Do not interrupt him, Caesar vocalized. A sharp, staccato bark. 2 short bursts, 1 long. Immediately, 3 of the chimps reformed, locking into a tight delta formation. The others continued their chaotic spiral, drawing enemy fire. Vasquez stared at her console. The enemy's targeting the scattered units. They're leaving the formation exposed. Exactly, Caesar barked again. Different cadence. The scattered units suddenly reversed, burning hard toward the enemy cruisers at an angle that defied tactical logic. They're going to collide, Vasquez said. Wait. The scattered units didn't collide. They threaded the needle, passing within meters of each other, their momentum carrying them directly into the enemy formation's blind spot. The Delta Formation, forgotten by the enemy targeting systems, opened fire. 3 kills, clean, precise, devastating. The simulation ended, enemy destroyed, 0 friendly casualties. Caesar leaned back in his harness, vocalized once, a long, satisfied hoot. Then he held out his hand. Eris walked over and placed a banana cluster in his palm. 5 bananas, perfectly ripe. Good work, Caesar. He peeled 1 banana, offered it to the chimp in the simulator beside him, a smaller male, scarred across the left shoulder. The subordinate took it, ducking his head in deference. Caesar ate the rest. Kincaid stepped up beside Eris, his voice low. They just executed a feint and flank maneuver that would take human pilots 3 weeks of drill to coordinate. Yes. Using vocalizations I can't understand and hand signals I can't read. Yes. And the entire strategy was decided in under 4 seconds. Correct. Kincaid rubbed his face. I am taking orders from a sovereign entity whose primary motivation is a piece of fruit and whose rank is determined by who can throw the hardest. Eris smiled. Welcome to the future of warfare, General. Kincaid looked at Caesar, at the Alpha sitting in his cockpit, grooming the chimp beside him with 1 hand while eating a banana with the other. This is officially worse than the AI wars. Caesar looked up, made eye contact with Kincaid, held it. Then he slowly, deliberately, bared his teeth. Not a smile. A challenge. Kincaid stared back. For a long, tense moment, neither moved. Then Kincaid reached into the containment pouch on his belt, pulled out a single banana, held it up. Caesar's expression didn't change. Kincaid tossed the banana. Caesar caught it one-handed. Perfect reflex. The Alpha examined the fruit, sniffed it, then nodded once. He turned back to his controls. Kincaid walked toward the door. Eris followed. General? Doctor? That went better than I expected. Kincaid paused at the threshold, looked back at the chimp squadron, already prepping for the next simulation run. Get me a direct line to procurement, he said, and update the fleet logistics. Why? Kincaid's expression was carved from stone and grim humor. Because if we're going to war with this fleet, I need to make damn sure we never run out of bananas. The door sealed behind them. Inside the bay, Caesar hooted once. The squadron responded in perfect unison. The sound echoed through the dome like a war cry. The centrifuge looked like a monument to human arrogance. 50 meters of reinforced titanium and carbon composite, built to spin fast enough to simulate the crushing acceleration of modern space combat. It had cost $300 million. It had killed 2 test pilots during the AI wars, back when humanity thought machines could solve the G-force problem better than biology. Now it was going to answer a different question. How much punishment could a chimpanzee survive before it stopped being useful? Dr. Elias Thorne stood in the observation booth, surrounded by screens displaying biometric data that updated faster than human eyes could process. Heart rate, blood oxygen, neural activity, hydraulic pressure in the reinforced flight suit that kept Caesar's blood from pooling in his extremities. General Kincaid stood beside her, watching the main viewport. Caesar was strapped into the centrifuge pod, his body encased in the prototype combat suit. The suit was matte black, covered in sensor nodes, with a helmet that looked more like a fighter pilot's gear than anything designed for a primate. Caesar's eyes were visible through the visor. Calm, focused, waiting. Standard human tolerance is 9 Gs, Eris said, her voice clinical. Peak combat pilots, the absolute best we've ever produced, can sustain that for maybe 30 seconds before they lose consciousness. After that, we're looking at stroke, hemorrhage, death. And the chimps? We don't know yet. That's why we're here. She activated the intercom. Caesar, we're starting the sequence. Signal if you need to stop. Caesar raised one hand, thumb up. The gesture was deliberate, learned. He'd watched enough human technicians to know what it meant. Eris entered the command sequence. The centrifuge began to spin. 1G, 2, 3. Caesar's biometrics stayed stable. His breathing deepened, his heart rate elevated, but within acceptable parameters. The suit's hydraulic system engaged, applying counterpressure to his legs and torso. 4 Gs. 5. A human pilot would be grunting now, fighting to keep blood in their brain. Caesar's expression didn't change. His hands remained steady on the control grips built into the pod. 6, 7, 8. Caesar's lips pulled back from his teeth, not a grimace, a snarl. 9 Gs, the number that separated human pilots from corpses. Caesar's vital signs spiked, heart rate climbing, blood pressure redlining, but his neural activity remained sharp, focused. No loss of consciousness, no signs of cognitive impairment. He's still functional, Eris said, increasing to 10. Kincaid leaned closer to the viewport. 10 Gs. Caesar's entire body tensed. The muscles in his shoulders and arms stood out like cables under the suit. His breathing came in sharp, rapid bursts, but his eyes stayed open, alert. 11. The centrifuge screamed, the sound of metal under stress. Bearings pushed beyond their design limits. Caesar vocalized, a low, guttural sound that built in intensity. 12. The scream became a roar. 13. Caesar's left hand spasmed. His right maintained grip. The biometric display showed patterns Eris had never seen before. Neural activity concentrated in the amygdala, the hippocampus, the parts of the brain responsible for fear, rage, survival. 14. Blood vessels in Caesar's eyes ruptured. Red spread across the whites like spilled wine. That's enough, Kincaid said. Eris didn't stop. 15. Caesar's mouth opened. His body convulsed once, twice, then he vomited. The fluid sprayed across the interior of the pod, coating the viewport, the control panels, everything. The centrifuge's interior camera feed turned into a brown and yellow abstract painting. Eris slammed the emergency stop. The centrifuge decelerated. 10 seconds of controlled spin-down that felt like an eternity. The pod hissed open. Caesar sat in his harness, covered in his own vomit, eyes bloodshot, chest heaving. He looked directly at Eris through the observation window. Then he raised his hand again. Thumb up, not surrender. Confirmation. He could take 15 Gs, and he could stay conscious. Kincaid's voice was quiet. Jesus Christ. Eris was already running calculations on her data pad. 15 sustained Gs gives them a 40% tactical advantage over any documented alien fighter craft. They can execute turns that enemy targeting systems won't predict because the physics shouldn't allow biological pilots to survive them. They barely survived that. No, Eris looked up. They thrived in it. Did you see his neural patterns? That wasn't pain tolerance. That was combat readiness. He was angry, but he was functional. A human would be dead or brain damaged. Caesar was still processing tactical information. She pulled up a comparison chart. Human pilot performance curves versus chimpanzee theoretical limits. Standard engagement doctrine says you can't sustain high-G maneuvers for more than a few seconds without losing combat effectiveness. Caesar just proved he can operate at 15 Gs for over 30 seconds. That's enough time to execute an attack run, evade counterfire, and reposition for a second strike. Kincaid watched through the viewport as medical technicians helped Caesar out of the pod. The chimp was walking on his own, slightly unsteady but mobile. They handed him a water pouch. He drank, vocalized, a hoarse, exhausted sound. Then he looked back at the centrifuge and hooted. "He wants to go again," Eris said. "Absolutely not. General, this is exactly the kind of psychological profile we need. He's not traumatized. He's not afraid. He's competitive. He wants to prove he can handle more." Kincaid turned to face her. "Dr. Thorne, I have spent 30 years watching good people turn themselves into weapons for the sake of military advantage. I have authorized treatments, augmentations, and training regimens that would make a war crimes tribunal weep. But I have never, ever asked someone to do something that would make them vomit from sheer physical stress, and then ask them to do it again. He's not someone, General. He's a sovereign pilot with enhanced physiology specifically designed for this kind of stress. He's a living being who just had his internal organs compressed to the point of systemic failure." Eris met his stare, and he survived. Better than that, he remained combat effective. That's not a weakness, General. That's a weapon. Kincaid's jaw worked. "You want to weaponize vomit. I want to weaponize everything." She pulled up a new file on her datapad. Tactical schematics, engineering specifications, fluid dynamics calculations. The enemy expects missiles. They expect energy weapons. They expect kinetic strikes. They do not expect organic projectiles traveling at combat velocities. She expanded the schematic. A modified waste management system integrated into the fighter cockpit. We install a pressurized containment field, route the pilot's biological waste, vomit, anything the body expels under stress, into a deployable launch tube. During high-G maneuvers, when the pilot is at maximum physical stress, we give them the option to purge. You want to turn their weakness into ammunition. I want to turn their biology into an advantage. Alien ships have energy shields designed to stop coherent light, plasma, and solid projectiles. Those shields are useless against organic matter. It's semi-solid, low-velocity, irregular mass distribution. The targeting computers won't recognize it as a threat until it's already impacted. She pulled up combat footage from the Council's own training exercises. Pristine warships executing perfect tactical formations. Their doctrine is built on precision, clean engagements, predictable physics. We're going to introduce chaos. Kincaid stared at the schematic. This is insane. This is asymmetric warfare. This is going to make humanity the laughingstock of the galaxy. Eris smiled. Only if we lose. 3 weeks later, the first prototype was ready. The modified fighter sat in testing bay 12, its hull gleaming under harsh LED lighting. From the outside, it looked identical to the standard single-pilot craft. Sleek, aggressive, built for speed. Inside, the cockpit had been transformed. The standard waste reclamation system, designed to process biological matter and recycle it into safe, inert compounds, had been replaced with a weapons-grade containment and launch system. Reinforced tanks, pressurized tubes, a manual trigger built into the control yoke. Caesar sat in the pilot's seat, examining the modifications with the careful attention of an engineer inspecting a new tool. Lieutenant Vasquez stood beside the cockpit, holding a datapad with the technical specifications. "It's a single-use system per sortie," she explained, pointing at the containment tank. "Once you purge, the tank needs to be manually refilled and pressurized. The launch mechanism uses compressed gas, not explosives, so it won't trigger enemy proximity sensors. Caesar tilted his head, touched the trigger on the yoke. Do not activate that in the hangar, Vasquez said quickly. Please. Caesar looked at her. His expression was unreadable. Then he hooted softly and moved his hand away from the trigger. Vasquez exhaled. Eris climbed up to the cockpit platform. We're running a live fire test today. Remote-controlled target drone. Standard Council cruiser configuration. Energy shields at full strength. She handed Caesar a sealed pouch. Protein paste, high fiber. Designed to maximize biological response under stress. Eat this 30 minutes before launch. It'll give your system enough material to work with. Caesar took the pouch, squeezed it, sniffed it, made a face. I know, Eris said. It's disgusting, but it's effective. Caesar ripped open the pouch and drank the contents in 3 long pulls. His face contorted. He made a retching sound. Then he tossed the empty pouch over his shoulder and gave Vasquez a thumbs up. You're enjoying this, Vasquez muttered. Caesar grinned, all teeth. The test range was 100,000 kilometers of empty space, monitored by sensor buoys and automated camera drones. The target, a decommissioned Council escort frigate purchased through a third party, hung in the void like a metal corpse. Its shields were active, full strength, the kind of barrier that could absorb a direct hit from a plasma lance without losing integrity. Caesar's fighter launched from the testing platform, engines flaring blue-white. His voice came through the comms, a series of short vocalizations that the translation AI had learned to interpret. Ready. Target acquired. Engaging. Eris watched from the command center, her screens filled with telemetry data. Caesar, execute high G approach. Maximum acceleration. Trigger the launch system at optimal range. Caesar's acknowledgement was a single sharp bark. The fighter's engine screamed. Acceleration climbed. 5 Gs, 8, 12. On the internal camera feed, Caesar's face twisted. His body strained against the harness. His breathing became labored, desperate. 14 Gs. His hand moved to the secondary trigger. 15 Gs. The biological response was immediate. Caesar's body convulsed. The containment system activated automatically, routing the expelled material into the pressurized tanks. Caesar's hand slammed the launch trigger. The organic projectile, a semi-solid mass of partially digested protein paste and biological waste, ejected from the fighter at low velocity. Irregular, unpredictable, completely invisible to the frigate's targeting computers. The shields didn't activate. The mass hit the frigate's forward sensor array dead center. In vacuum, the material flash froze on impact. The organic compounds crystallized, spreading across the optical sensors like a coat of brown ice. The energy shields flickered, confused by the lack of kinetic or thermal energy signature. Caesar's fighter banked hard, a second pass. This time he fired the standard kinetic payload. The frigate's targeting systems were blind. The shields, still calibrated for high-energy threats, failed to compensate. The kinetic round punched through the hull like paper. Mission success. Eris leaned back in her chair. Kincaid stood behind her, arms crossed. It worked, he said. His voice was flat, emotionless. It worked, Eris confirmed. On the main screen, Caesar's fighter performed a victory roll, a maneuver no tactical manual would ever recommend, pure showboating. His voice came through the comms, a long, triumphant howl. Vasquez looked up from her console. Ma'am, should I log this as a successful weapons test? Aris considered. Log it as proof of concept for organic-based countermeasures against energy shielding. And in plain English? Eris smiled. We just turned vomit into a war crime. Kincaid walked toward the door, paused. Dr. Thorne. Yes, General? When the Council finds out about this, they are going to lose their minds. I certainly hope so, General. The door sealed behind him. Eris turned back to her screens. Caesar's fighter was returning to dock, engines cooling, cockpit interior still coated in frozen biological residue. She opened a new file, updated the tactical database. Weapon classification, biological countermeasure, non-lethal, high disgust factor. Deployment status, approved for full squadron integration, estimated enemy psychological impact, Severe. She saved the file. On the screen, Caesar emerged from his fighter, still wearing his vomit-stained flight suit. The deck crew kept their distance. He hooted once, loud, proud. Then he walked toward the nearest food dispensary and requested 6 bananas. The future of warfare had arrived, and it smelled terrible. The war room was silent except for the hum of holographic projectors and the quiet breathing of 37 officers who were about to watch their entire tactical doctrine get dismantled by primates. Admiral Chen stood at the head of the room, her uniform pressed to razor edges, her expression carved from ice and professional skepticism. She had commanded fleets through the Outer Rim conflicts. She had authored 3 papers on coordinated strike tactics. She did not believe in miracles, luck, or the combat effectiveness of chimpanzees. She especially did not believe they could beat her. The holographic display showed 2 fleets. Blue markers for the Human Control Group. Red markers for Project MONKE. 20 ships per side. Identical loadouts. Identical starting positions. The only difference was the crews. Admiral Chen commanded the Blue Fleet from the Central Tactical Station. Her officers surrounded her, each one a specialist in their field. Communications, weapons, navigation, electronic warfare. The best Earth had to offer. On the other side of the display, Caesar sat in the command simulator of the Red Fleet. Around him, 16 chimpanzees occupied fighter positions, and in the rear support vessels, the bonobos waited. Dr. Elias Thorne stood near the back of the war room, data pad in hand. General Kincaid beside her, arms crossed. Standard fleet engagement parameters, Chen announced. No experimental weapons, no biological countermeasures, pure tactical maneuvering and fire coordination. We're testing command efficiency, not circus tricks. She looked directly at Eris. If your primates can't follow basic military doctrine, this entire project gets shelved. Understood? Eris met her gaze. Understood, Admiral. Though I think you'll find they follow their own doctrine quite well. Chen's lip curled slightly. Begin simulation. The holographic fleets activated. Both sides held position, waiting for the opening move. Chen didn't hesitate. Her fingers moved across her command console. Blue 7 through 12, advance in Delta formation. Blue 1 through 6, provide covering fire from current position. Blue 13 through 20, flank left at Mark 47. Her communications officer repeated the orders over the fleet channel. Confirmation signals lit up across the display. The Blue Fleet moved like clockwork, precise, professional, textbook perfect. Chen allowed herself a small smile. The Red Fleet didn't move. Caesar sat motionless in his command simulator, eyes tracking the Blue Fleet's advance. His hands rested on the control console. He made no sound. They're not responding, Chen's tactical officer said. No movement, no communications traffic. They're frozen, someone muttered. Scattered laughter rippled through the war room. Chen raised her hand for silence. Give them time. They're still learning basic formations. 15 seconds passed. 20. The Blue Fleet continued its advance, weapons charging, firing solutions calculating. Then Caesar moved. His hand touched a single control. Not a button, not a command input, just a pressure-sensitive pad that registered touch duration and intensity. On the display, nothing happened. 3 seconds later, everything happened at once. The Red Fleet exploded into motion, not scattered, not panicked, but in a pattern that made absolutely no tactical sense. 8 fighters broke hard right, 4 broke left, 3 accelerated directly toward the Blue Fleet at maximum burn. The rest held position. They're fragmenting, Chen's tactical officer reported. No coherent formation. They're making themselves vulnerable. Target the advancing units, Chen ordered. Blue Squadron, focus fire. Her fleet responded immediately. Energy weapons locked. Firing solutions confirmed. The 3 red fighters charging the blue line should have been obliterated. Instead, they scattered at the last possible second, their trajectories diverging at angles that put them directly into the blind spots of Chen's formation. How did they coordinate that? Chen demanded. There's no comm traffic, nothing on any frequency. Eris consulted her datapad. Because they're not using frequencies. On the rear support ships, the bonobos were moving. Unlike the aggressive, territorial chimpanzees, bonobos were builders of consensus, natural diplomats. They lived in female-dominated social structures where conflict was resolved through appeasement, food sharing, and physical affection. In human terms, they were peaceful. In tactical terms, they were perfect coordinators. The lead bonobo, a female designated Subject 12 but called Grace by the training staff, sat at the communication station of her support vessel. Her hands moved across the console, but she wasn't typing. She was touching specific panels in rhythmic patterns. The other bonobos responded instantly, not through speakers, not through visual displays, through haptic feedback built into their control stations, pressure patterns, duration, intensity, temperature variations. A language of touch, transmitted through their consoles, interpreted by their naturally cooperative social instincts. Grace touched her panel 3 times. Short, long, short. 4 support ships shifted position, moving to cover the scattered fighters. She touched again. Long, short, short, long. The fighters that had broken left suddenly reversed, creating a pincer movement that caught Chen's flank completely exposed. Unknown contacts converging on our port side, Chen's tactical officer said, her voice tight. They're using our own formation against us. Chen's hands flew across her console. Blue 13 through 16, break formation and engage. Blue 6, redirect fire to support flank defense. The orders went out. Her crews responded, but verbal commands took time. Confirmation, repetition, verification. Grace touched her console once, a single sustained pressure. Every red ship moved simultaneously, not in formation, not in pattern, in swarm. The scattered red fighters suddenly converged from 6 different vectors, their trajectories intersecting at the exact point where Chen's flank defense was weakest. They're everywhere, someone said. Chen's jaw tightened. All ships, defensive posture. Concentrate fire on the center mass. Her fleet began to regroup, pulling back into a tighter defensive sphere. It was the correct tactical decision. It was also exactly what Grace wanted. On her console, Grace made a gesture that would have meant nothing to a human observer. She reached across her panel and touched 2 points simultaneously, then dragged her fingers toward the center. To a bonobo, it meant something very simple. Come together. Share. Embrace. The Red Fleet collapsed inward, all 20 ships accelerating toward Chen's defensive sphere from every direction at once. They're going to ram us, Chen's weapons officer said. Hold fire until optimal range, Chen ordered. They can't all survive a suicide run. The Red Fleet closed to 2,000 kilometers, 1,500, 1,000. Chen's finger hovered over the firing command. 500 kilometers. Grace touched her console 3 times. Fast, urgent. The Red Fleet scattered. Not randomly, not in panic, in a perfect expanding spiral that put every single red ship outside Chen's optimal firing arc, while simultaneously positioning them for clear shots at the Blue Fleet's engines. They had used the threat of ramming to force Chen into a defensive posture, then exploited the split-second window when her ships were locked into predictable positions. All Blue ships report weapons lock, Chen's tactical officer said quietly. They have firing solutions on every vessel. Chen stared at the display. 12 seconds had passed since Grace made her first touch command. 12 seconds to coordinate a 20-ship maneuver that would have taken Chen's human crew 3 minutes of verbal communication to execute. End simulation, Chen said. The holographic fleets froze. Silence filled the war room. Chen walked away from her console, approached Eris. Explain. Eris turned her datapad around. The screen showed a real-time feed from Grace's console. Haptic pattern analysis, pressure mapping, duration tracking. Bonobos don't have verbal language in the wild. They communicate through physical touch, body language, and immediate social feedback. We gave them haptic interfaces. They built a command language faster than our AI translation systems could process. They're using touch. Coordinated instantaneous touch signals that every bonobo in the fleet interprets simultaneously. No lag, no misinterpretation. No need for confirmation. They feel the command and respond as a single unit. Chen studied the display. The frozen Red Fleet, perfectly positioned, utterly coordinated. And the chimpanzees? The chimps respond to the bonobos' positional changes. They don't need to understand the haptic language. They just react to the support ship's movements. It's pack behavior. The bonobos are the coordinators. The chimps are the execution. Chen looked at General Kincaid. This isn't a military command structure. No, Kincaid said. It's better. It's vulnerable. If you take out the support ships, the entire coordination network collapses. Try it, Eris said. Chen's eyes narrowed. Reset simulation. Same parameters. Blue Fleet will prioritize targeting the red support vessels. The holographic display reset. Both fleets returned to starting positions. Chen's hands moved before the starting signal even sounded. All blue ships, weapons free. Target designation. Enemy support craft. Ignore fighters. Kill the coordinators. Her fleet responded instantly. Every weapon system locked onto the 4 bonobo-piloted support ships. Caesar's eyes tracked the weapon locks. His lips pulled back from his teeth. He vocalized. A single, sharp bark. The 16 chimp fighters didn't scatter. They accelerated directly toward the blue fleet. Straight line. Maximum burn. No evasion. They're charging, Chen's tactical officer said. No defensive maneuvers. Hold targeting. Fire on my mark. The red fighters closed. 2,000 kilometers. 1,500. Chen waited. Let them come. Let them commit. 1,000 kilometers. Fire! The blue fleet's weapons discharged simultaneously. A coordinated alpha strike designed to cripple the support ships and collapse the red fleet's coordination network. The energy weapons lanced through space. Hit absolutely nothing. The bonobo support ships had moved, not scattered, not retreated. They had swapped positions with 4 of the charging fighters in the split second before the weapons fired. How? Chen's tactical officer started. The answer was already on Aris's datapad. Grace had made a single touch command. 1 sustained pressure, followed by 4 rapid taps. To a bonobo, it meant trade places. Urgent, trust me. To the chimps, it meant opportunity. The fighters Grace had swapped with had continued their charge, now in the rear position. The support ships, suddenly in the front line, dumped their entire velocity into a perpendicular burn that put them behind Chen's firing line. And the 4 chimps who should have been safely in the rear? They were now exactly where they wanted to be, inside Chen's optimal firing range. Weapons charged, targeting locked. Blue 7 through 10 are destroyed, the tactical officer reported. Direct hits, shields failed to compensate. Chen stared at the display. The red fleet had sacrificed nothing, lost nothing, and turned her own firing solution into a tactical advantage. They won by being polite, Kincaid said quietly. The bonobos asked the chimps to trade places. The chimps trusted them. No argument, no questioning, just immediate cooperation. Then they swarmed, Eris added. The moment the trade was complete, every ship knew exactly where every other ship was. They acted as one. Chen deactivated the simulation. I need a drink. She walked toward the door, paused. Dr. Thorne. Yes, Admiral. Deploy them, all of them. If this is what they can do in simulation, I want to see what they do to a real enemy. She left the war room. The officers began filing out, their conversations low, subdued. Kincaid stepped up beside Eris. You knew they'd win. I knew they'd adapt. Winning was just a bonus. On the display, Caesar climbed out of his simulator. Grace emerged from her support vessel cockpit. They met in the center of the virtual hangar. Grace extended her hand. Caesar took it, held it, a simple gesture. One species acknowledging another. Then Grace offered Caesar something she'd been holding, a small, wrapped object. Caesar unwrapped it. A banana. He hooted, soft, grateful, shared half with Grace. Kincaid watched the exchange. They're not just coordinated, are they? No, Eris said. They're family. The display went dark. In the silence, Eris updated her tactical assessment log. Bonobo coordination efficiency, 473% faster than human verbal command chain. Chimpanzee response trust factor, absolute combined fleet tactical advantage, overwhelming. Recommendation, immediate combat deployment. She saved the file. Somewhere in the training dome, Grace and Caesar sat together, eating bananas, grooming each other's fur, building trust, building something the galaxy had never seen before. A primate war machine that ran on cooperation, bananas, and the kind of instant, wordless understanding that no amount of military training could ever replicate. Admiral Chen was right about one thing. This wasn't a military command structure. It was something far more dangerous. The surveillance drone was smaller than a human fist, coated in metamaterial that bent light around its surface like water flowing over stone. It had cost the Galactic Council Intelligence Directorate 40 million credits. It could operate undetected for 6 months. It could record across 17 different spectrums simultaneously. And right now, it was watching something that made absolutely no sense. Operative Kelth 37, a Varanthi intelligence specialist with 2 decades of field experience, sat in his concealed observation post 3 kilometers from the human training facility. His 4 eyes tracked the drone's feed on multiple displays simultaneously. His translator implant processed the human comm chatter. His biometric sensors measured his own steadily rising confusion. The Varanthi were perfect for intelligence work. No emotions, no biases, pure logical analysis and photographic memory storage. Kelth 37 had infiltrated separatist cells, documented war crimes, and extracted information from hostile species without ever losing his clinical detachment. He was losing it now. On the primary display, a chimpanzee sat in the cockpit of a spacecraft worth more than some planetary defense budgets. The chimpanzee was eating a banana, with one hand, while the other hand executed a combat role that pulled 11 gravities of force. Kelth 37's translator implant beeped. It was struggling to classify the sounds coming from the training facility. Not language, not communication protocols, not standardized military call signs. Screaming. The chimpanzee was screaming while performing tactical maneuvers that would liquefy most known species. Kelth 37 made a note in his report log. Observation 4:47. Human pilots demonstrate extreme vocal distress during high acceleration maneuvers. Psychological fitness questionable. He expanded the drone's surveillance perimeter. 16 more spacecraft, all performing variations of the same insane flying, tight turns, vertical climbs, maneuvers that defied every principle of efficient fuel consumption and pilot safety, and in every cockpit, a primate. Kelth 37 zoomed in on one particular craft. The pilot, a smaller chimpanzee with distinctive scarring on its left arm, was drumming on the control console while executing a barrel roll. Drumming. Like percussion. Like rhythm. Not piloting. Dancing. Observation 3:8. Human pilots appear to treat combat spacecraft as recreational devices. Lack of discipline evident. The Varanthi operative's 4th eye tracked movement in the background of the feed. Human technicians approaching one of the landed craft. They carried equipment, medical scanners, and fruit. Kelth 37 enhanced the image. The human technician held up a cluster of bananas. The chimpanzee pilot climbed out of the cockpit still wearing its flight suit and took the offered fruit. Then it sat on the wing of a 1 billion credit warship and ate. The human technician scratched the chimpanzee's head. The chimpanzee vocalized, a low, pleased sound. The human smiled. Kelth 37 felt something he hadn't experienced in 17 years of intelligence work. Doubt. He rewound the footage, watched it again, enhanced, analyzed, cross-referenced with every known human military protocol in the galactic database. Nothing matched. Human military doctrine emphasized hierarchy, discipline, standardized communication. These pilots were doing none of that. They were screaming. They were eating in their cockpits. They were being groomed by their ground crews like pets. Unless. Kelth 37's mind worked through the logical possibilities. Hypothesis 1. Humans have suffered catastrophic crew shortage and are using untrained civilians. He dismissed it. The flight patterns were too precise, sloppy in style, but effective in execution. Hypothesis 2. Humans are testing new psychological warfare doctrine, unpredictability as tactical advantage. Possible, but inefficient. You couldn't maintain crew cohesion with that much chaos. Hypothesis 3. These are not pilots at all. Kelth 37 enhanced the image further, focused on the chimpanzee's hands, 4 fingers, opposable thumbs, primate physiology, cranial structure consistent with great apes. He accessed the Galactic Biological Database. Cross-referenced primate species. Found the entry. Pan-troglodytes. Status: extinct. Last viable population: Earth, Holocene epoch. Intelligence level: tool using, but pre-technological. Not considered sophont under galactic law. Kelth 37 read the entry 3 times. Then he pulled up the current intelligence brief on human fleet composition. Human claim: new allied species serving as pilots. Legal status: sovereign entity. Species classification: classified. The pieces clicked together in his mind like a weapon being assembled. The humans hadn't found allies. They had resurrected an extinct species, enhanced them, and put them in spacecraft. But why? He rewound the high-G maneuver footage, watched the chimpanzee pull 15 gravities while remaining conscious. No human could do that. Most species in the Galactic Council would be paced. Hypothesis. 4. Humans have developed organic CPU hybrid pilots, biological processing units with enhanced physical tolerance. It was the only explanation that made sense. The fruit wasn't food, it was maintenance. Chemical rewards to reinforce correct behavior patterns. The grooming wasn't affection, it was biomechanical calibration. The humans had built organic artificial intelligence, and they were pretending it was a sovereign species to circumvent Resolution 909. Kelth 37 felt what might have been satisfaction. He had uncovered the deception. He had evidence, video, biometric data, behavioral analysis. The council would be pleased. He began compiling his report. Then the chimpanzee on the screen did something that made Kelth 37 stop typing. It looked directly at the surveillance drone. Kelth 37's primary eyes focused on the display. The chimpanzee was staring at a point in space that should have been empty. The drone was cloaked, invisible, silent. The chimpanzee tilted its head, vocalized something to the human technician. The human looked up, scanned the sky, shook their head, dismissed it. The chimpanzee kept staring. For 5 long seconds, it maintained eye contact with a drone it shouldn't have been able to see. Then it bared its teeth and returned to eating its banana. Kelth 37 checked the drone systems. All operational. Cloak active. No emissions detectable. The chimpanzee couldn't have seen it, except it had looked right at it. Kelth 37 made a note. Observation 449. Possible enhanced sensory capability in organic CPU units. Further investigation required. He continued monitoring. Over the next 4 hours, he documented 17 more anomalies. A bonobo in one of the support craft appeared to be communicating with other ships without using any radio frequencies. Kelth 37 scanned across all known spectrums. Nothing. Yet the support ships moved in perfect synchronization. A chimpanzee pilot vomited in its cockpit after a high G turn. The human ground crew didn't express disgust or concern. They collected the biological matter in a sealed container and loaded it into the ship's weapons bay. Weaponized vomit. Kelth 37 added it to his report with a note of professional skepticism. 2 bonobos engaged in what appeared to be intimate physical contact while simultaneously piloting their separate vessels through a complex defensive pattern. The humans didn't intervene. They observed and took notes. And through it all, the constant exchange of fruit, bananas, apples, protein supplements packaged to look like natural food, maintenance. It had to be maintenance. Except, Kelth 37 watched one particular exchange. A human trainer offering a banana to Caesar, the apparent command unit. Caesar took it, but instead of eating it immediately, he broke it in half and offered part of it to the smaller chimpanzee beside him. The smaller chimp took the offered food, vocalized softly, a sound that Kelth 37's translator categorized as gratitude. Caesar touched the smaller chimp's shoulder, a gesture that the Galactic Behavioral Database classified as social bonding. Not a CPU rewarding a subroutine, not a commander distributing rations, something else. Kelth 37 flagged the footage as priority analysis and continued his surveillance. By the end of his shift, he had compiled 217 observations, 43 hypotheses, and 1 conclusion that violated every principle of his training. The organic CPU hypothesis didn't fit. CPUs didn't share food. They didn't make social gestures. They didn't stare at invisible drones with what looked disturbingly like awareness. CPUs didn't look bored when they weren't flying. But these primates did. Kelth 37 watched one chimpanzee, grounded for maintenance, sit on the hangar floor and stack equipment crates into a tower for no apparent purpose. When a human knocked the tower over, the chimpanzee rebuilt it, then knocked it over itself and hooted. It was playing. Kelth 37 closed his report log, opened a new file, flagged it as confidential priority 1. He began writing. Intelligence assessment. Human fleet composition operative, Kelth 37, Varanthi. Intelligence Directorate, date, Galactic Standard, 7749-3 summary. The human fleet designated Project MONKE does not utilize conventional pilots. Analysis of surveillance data indicates the use of biological entities resembling extinct Earth primate species, Pan troglodytes and Pan paniscus. Primary hypothesis. These entities are sophisticated organic processors designed to circumvent Resolution 909's prohibition on synthetic intelligence. They demonstrate enhanced physical capabilities, rapid reaction times, and coordinated tactical behavior consistent with networked AI systems. Supporting evidence. Physical tolerance exceeding known biological limits. 15 plus G-forces sustained. Nonverbal coordination across multiple vessels without detectable communication. Behavioral conditioning using food-based reward systems. Integration with advanced military hardware. Tactical assessment. Despite unconventional appearance, these organic CPU systems demonstrate combat effectiveness exceeding standard Council fighter doctrine. High-G maneuvers create tactical unpredictability. Coordination speed suggests minimal command lag. Recommended response. Council fleet elements should prepare for engagement with targets capable of extreme acceleration and erratic movement patterns. Standard targeting protocols may prove insufficient. Secondary. Notation. Behavioral anomalies observed suggest potential instability in organic CPU architecture. Units demonstrate non-essential activities, play behavior, social bonding, resource sharing, that may indicate processing errors or emergent properties requiring further study. Conclusion. Humans have developed organic artificial intelligence masquerading as sovereign species. Legal loophole exploitation confirmed. Military threat assessment, moderate to high. Kelth 37 reviewed his report. Precise, professional, supported by evidence. He encrypted the file and prepared to transmit to Council Intelligence Headquarters. His finger hovered over the send command. On his monitor, Caesar climbed back into his cockpit. A human technician handed him something. Not fruit, a small object wrapped in cloth. Caesar unwrapped it carefully, held it up. A photograph, human style, printed on physical media. The image showed Caesar standing beside Dr. Elias Thorne. Both of them, together. The human's hand on Caesar's shoulder. Caesar looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he carefully folded it and tucked it into a compartment in his flight suit. Over his heart. The human technician said something. Caesar responded with a soft vocalization. The human smiled. Genuine warmth. Caesar reached out and touched the human's hand. A gesture of connection. Then he sealed his cockpit and prepared for flight. Kelth 37 stared at the screen. CPUs didn't keep photographs. CPUs didn't make sentimental gestures. CPUs didn't form emotional attachments to their handlers, unless they weren't CPUs at all. Kelth 37's four eyes refocused on his report, on the clinical language, on the logical conclusions, on everything his training told him was true. Then he looked at Caesar, flying his ship with precision and joy and something that looked disturbingly like pride. The Varanthi operative made a decision. He added one more line to his report. Additional assessment. Possibility exists that observed entities are genuine biological intelligences, not artificial constructs. If true, humans have successfully uplifted extinct species to SOFONT status. Legal implications. Catastrophic for Council enforcement of Resolution 909. Recommendation. Immediate high-level diplomatic intervention required. Military response alone will not resolve this situation. He sent the report. Then he packed his surveillance equipment and prepared to extract. As he dismantled his observation post, he watched the primate fleet conduct one final training exercise. Perfect coordination, absolute trust. 17 ships moving like a single organism. Kelth 37 had spent 20 years analyzing threats, categorizing enemies, predicting outcomes. He had never been frightened before. He was frightened now, not because the primates were dangerous, but because they might actually be people, and if they were people, the Council had just threatened a sovereign species with glassing. Kelth 37 finished his extraction and disappeared into the night. Behind him, the training facility lights blazed. The primate fleet continued its exercises, and Caesar, holding his photograph close, flew into the simulated darkness with the kind of courage that couldn't be programmed, only earned. The suit hung in the prep bay like a monument to humanity's guilt and genius in equal measure. Matte black composite armor, reinforced life support, neural interface nodes clustered along the spine, haptic feedback systems woven through the gloves. Everything a combat pilot needed to survive in the vacuum of space and the hell of high-G maneuvers. And one system that had nothing to do with survival. Dr. Elias Thorne stood before the suit, datapad in hand, staring at the small control module embedded in the chest plate. It was barely larger than her thumb, innocuous, almost invisible among the other systems, but it was the most important component in the entire design. General Kincaid entered the prep bay, his boots echoing on the metal grating. He stopped beside Eris, following her gaze to the control module. "The shock collar," he said. Not a question, an acknowledgement. Eris didn't look at him. "Pain compliance system. Remote activated. Delivers graduated neural stimulation ranging from mild discomfort to complete motor function disruption. In plain English, it hurts them until they obey." Kincaid was silent for a moment. "And the trigger? Proximity to Earth. Any ship equipped with these suits that enters low Earth orbit without authorization receives an automatic warning. If the pilot doesn't reverse course within 60 seconds, the system activates. You built a fence. I built insurance." Eris finally looked at him. "We gave them ships, General, weapons, training. We made them powerful enough to fight a galactic war. We had to build something to make sure they never turn those weapons on us." Kincaid studied the suit. The sleek lines, the advanced technology, the hidden cruelty. Does Caesar know? They all know. We were transparent about it from the beginning. Part of the sovereignty agreement. They have full autonomy in space, but Earth is off limits unless they're specifically invited. And they agreed. They didn't have a choice. No shock collar, no fleet, no sovereignty. Eris set down her datapad. We gave them freedom, and then immediately limited it. That's the deal humanity made with them. That's the deal humanity forced on them. Eris met his gaze. "Yes, it is." The door to the prep bay opened. Caesar entered, flanked by 2 human technicians. He moved with the loose-limbed confidence of someone who owned every space he entered. His eyes tracked the suit, then Eris, then Kincaid. He vocalized, a questioning grunt. Eris gestured to the suit. "Final fitting, Caesar. Last chance to make adjustments before deployment." Caesar approached the suit slowly, reached out and touched the chest plate. His fingers traced the neural interface nodes, the life support connections, the reinforced joints. Then they stopped on the control module. He looked at Eris. His expression was unreadable. She pulled up a schematic on her datapad, showed him the system layout, the proximity triggers, the pain gradients, everything. "You remember our agreement," she said quietly. "You can go anywhere in the galaxy, fight whoever you want, build whatever civilization you choose, but Earth is protected. If you come home without permission, this activates." Caesar stared at the schematic, at the clean technical lines that represented agony encoded into circuitry. He touched the control module again, harder this time. Then he vocalized, a single, sharp bark. The translation AI on Eris's datapad beeped. Understood. One of the technicians stepped forward with the suit's underlayer, a flexible garment embedded with biometric sensors and neural interface threads. Caesar allowed them to help him into it. The material conformed to his body, tightening, adjusting, becoming a second skin. Then came the armor plating, chest piece, back piece, limb guards. Each section locked into place with magnetic seals that hummed with contained energy. The helmet came last, transparent faceplate, enhanced visual displays, communication systems, and built into the neural crown, another small module, backup pain compliance, in case the chest unit failed. Caesar stood fully suited, a primate wrapped in human technology, transformed into something between soldier and prisoner. He moved, tested the joints, flexed his hands. The suit responded perfectly, amplifying his movements, supporting his strength. Kincaid activated the external speaker. "How does it feel?" Caesar turned to face him. The faceplate made his features harder to read, but his eyes were visible. Clear, intelligent. He raised one hand, gave a thumbs up. Then he pointed at the control module on his chest, made a gesture. A quick, sharp movement. The translation AI struggled for a moment, then produced text. Question: what happens if we remove it? Eris had been expecting this question for months. The suit won't function. Life support fails. Neural interface disconnects. You'd be wearing dead weight. Caesar tilted his head. Question: what if we disable it without removing it? The suit detects tampering. Automatic activation. Full intensity. For 30 seconds. Question: what if we land somewhere else? Not Earth. Another planet. The system only triggers for Earth. Everywhere else, you're free. Caesar absorbed this, processed it. Then he made another gesture. Statement: humans are afraid of us. Eris felt something twist in her chest. Yes, we are. Question: why give us ships if you fear us? Because we needed you. Because the galaxy gave us no choice. Because sometimes you have to create something dangerous to fight something worse. Caesar stood motionless for a long moment. Then he vocalized. A long, complex series of sounds that the translation AI parsed slowly. Statement: we understand fear. We understand necessity. We understand the bargain. Statement: you made us people. You gave us purpose. You gave us stars. Statement: the collar is the price. We accept it. Question: will you ever trust us enough to remove it? Eris looked at Kincaid. The general's expression was carved from stone. She looked back at Caesar. I don't know. Caesar nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. He turned and walked toward the airlock that led to the hangar. The suit's systems hummed around him. The shock collar remained dormant, waiting. At the threshold, he paused, looked back, made one final gesture. The translation AI hesitated, then displayed the text. Statement: one day you will have to choose, trust or control. You cannot have both forever. Then he was gone. Kincaid exhaled slowly. He's right. I know. If they ever figure out how to disable those collars, they won't. The system is hardened against tampering, multiple redundancies, fail-safes. Eris. Kincaid's voice was gentle, almost sad. They learned to fly spacecraft in 6 months. They developed their own tactical doctrine in weeks. They weaponized vomit. Do you really think they won't eventually figure out how to hack a pain compliance system? Eris was silent. Kincaid continued. And when they do, what happens? Do we detonate the ships remotely? Do we activate every collar simultaneously and hope the pain makes them surrender? Do we try to negotiate with a species we've just tortured? What would you have me do, General? Send them into combat with no safeguards? Give them unlimited access to weapons and ships and hope they never decide humanity isn't worth protecting? I would have you admit that we've created a problem with no good solution. We uplifted them because we needed soldiers. We gave them sovereignty because we needed legal cover. And we collared them because we're terrified of what we made. He walked toward the door. Paused. Caesar is right. One day we'll have to choose. And I don't think we're going to like either option. He left. Eris stood alone in the prep bay, surrounded by 17 more suits hanging in their cradles. Each one a miracle of engineering. Each one a confession of fear. She pulled up her datapad, reviewed the deployment checklist. Suits complete. Tested, armed with their hidden cruelty. Ships fueled, armed, ready for combat. Pilots, trained, coordinated, sovereign. She checked the final box. Pain compliance systems, active. The fleet would deploy in 48 hours. They would fight humanity's enemies. They would protect Earth from galactic consequences. They would prove that biological intelligence could defeat the Council's sophisticated fleets, and they would do it all while wearing collars. Arya saved the file. Then she did something she hadn't done since the project began. She opened a new document, personal log, encrypted, and she wrote, "We told ourselves this was necessary. We told ourselves this was protection. We told ourselves we were giving them freedom. But freedom with a shock collar isn't freedom. It's just a longer leash. Caesar asked if we'll ever trust them enough to remove it. I told him I didn't know. The truth is worse. I don't know if we'll ever trust ourselves enough to remove it. We're sending them to war wearing our fear. And I don't know which terrifies me more. That they'll succeed despite it, or that one day they'll succeed because of it." Project MONKE was supposed to solve our problem with the Galactic Council. I think we just created a bigger problem with ourselves. She closed the log, encrypted it, buried it in her personal files where no one would ever read it. In the hangar, Caesar stood among his squadron, 17 chimpanzees and 4 bonobos, all suited, all collared, all sovereign. Grace, the lead bonobo, approached him, made a gentle gesture. A question. Caesar responded, pointed at his chest, at the control module glowing softly beneath the armor. Grace understood. She touched her own chest, her own collar. They all wore them. They all knew what they meant. Grace made another gesture, not a question this time, a statement. Caesar watched her hands, then he vocalized. Agreement. Around them, the rest of the pilots gathered. Human technicians stepped back, giving them space. Caesar raised his hands, made a series of gestures, complex, layered, the kind of communication that required intelligence, intention, purpose. The translation AI, monitoring from a dozen different angles, struggled to parse it, finally produced text. Statement to fleet. The humans gave us ships. They gave us stars. They gave us purpose. Statement. They also gave us chains, invisible, waiting. Statement. We accepted the bargain because we had no choice. Because slavery with purpose is better than freedom without meaning. Question to fleet. When we fight, what do we fight for? The pilots responded, each one making their own gesture, their own answer. For food, for family, for the stars, for ourselves, for the humans who made us, against the humans who chained us, for the chance to prove we are more than tools. Caesar absorbed every answer. Then he made one final statement. Statement. We fight because we are alive, because we are people, because we deserve to exist. Statement. The collar cannot change that. Statement. One day we will be free, truly free. Not because they give us permission, but because we take what we have earned. Statement. Until then, we fly, we fight, we survive. Statement. And we remember. He pointed at the stars visible through the hangar's atmospheric shield. Statement. The galaxy will learn what we are, not from human declarations, not from legal documents. Statement. From watching us fly. The pilots vocalized in unison. A sound that wasn't quite a howl and wasn't quite a war cry. It was a promise. The technicians didn't understand it. The translation AI couldn't fully capture it. But somewhere, in her office, reviewing deployment orders, Dr. Elias Thorne felt a chill run down her spine. Because she understood one thing with absolute certainty. Humanity had just armed a species that would one day decide they didn't need humanity anymore. And when that day came, the shock collars wouldn't save them. Nothing would. The Council patrol cruiser Harmonious Verdict had been stationed in Sector 7 Kappa for 3 standard cycles without incident. Captain Velnoth of the Ascendancy Fleet considered this posting a reward for his exemplary service record. No pirate raids, no territorial disputes. Just the silent, predictable void between jurisdictions where nothing ever happened. His sensor officer, a young Drayan with precisely calibrated optical implants, broke the silence first. Contact. Multiple signatures emerging from jump coordinates 77 Mark III. Velnoth adjusted his ceremonial collar and gestured for the display. 12 ships. Human design, but the silhouettes were wrong. Too compact, too aggressive. The engine signatures radiated excess heat like the vessels were perpetually on the verge of melting. "Hail them, standard challenge protocol." The communications officer complied, broadcasting in 17 languages simultaneously, as council law required. "Unidentified vessels, you have entered a restricted patrol zone. Identify your command structure and submit to inspection or withdraw immediately." Silence. Then a sound. It started low, a rhythmic huffing that the translation matrix couldn't parse. Then it escalated, a series of sharp, guttural barks that climbed in pitch and intensity until the bridge speakers crackled with distortion. Velnoth's head tendrils stiffened. Is that their response? The communications officer looked genuinely disturbed. "Sir, I believe that is their command frequency. The signal is biological. No encryption, no linguistic structure, just vocalization." In the command center of the lead human vessel, General Kincaid stood behind the observation rail, his knuckles white against the metal. He was watching the external feed of Caesar's cockpit. The Alpha Chimp was strapped into a flight harness that looked more like a restraint system from a psychiatric facility than military hardware. Caesar's lips were pulled back. His teeth were bared. His eyes were locked on the sensor display showing the council ships in perfect formation, their shields glowing a smug, confident blue. Kincaid activated his direct line to Ambassador Thorne, who was observing from the secondary bridge. "He's not following the script." Thorne's voice was calm, almost bored. "He never does, General. That's why he's effective." We agreed. "Hold position. Wait for them to scan us. Let them see the biological signatures. Then we negotiate." "Caesar doesn't negotiate, General. He competes. And right now, those ships are in his territory, making loud noises and flashing bright lights. You know what that means to him." Kincaid felt his stomach drop. "Thorne, if he engages without authorization, then we have plausible deniability. He's a sovereign pilot, remember? We can't control him. We can only advise." On the council cruiser, the sensor officer's secondary screen lit up with a priority alert. "Captain, the lead vessel is accelerating. Intercept vector." Velnoth straightened. "Activate defensive shields. Prepare a warning volley. Do not escalate to lethal force. These are human ships. Protocol demands we capture, not destroy." The shields hummed to life. Interlocking energy fields designed to deflect plasma, absorb kinetic impacts, and disperse laser fire across a massive surface area. The Council had been at war for 3,000 years. Their shields had stopped everything. Caesar's ship screamed forward, pulling Gs that would have liquefied a human pilot's internal organs. The flight computer aboard the human carrier registered the maneuver and immediately flagged it as a suicide run. But Caesar wasn't suicidal. He was angry. His hands, both of them, gripped the control columns. His feet, prehensile and strong, worked the secondary thrusters with a dexterity no human could match. He didn't aim for the cruiser's bridge. He didn't aim for the engines. He aimed for the sensor array. The eyes. The council crew watched in confused horror as the tiny, erratic human ship didn't fire a single weapon. Instead, it vented atmosphere, but not clean atmosphere. Velnoth's sensor officer gasped. "Captain, they're deploying something. Organic matter. High moisture content. Biological signature is..." The officer stopped talking. On the main display, a cloud of semi-solid, dark brown material was expanding rapidly from the human ship's waste reclamation ports, a concentrated, pressurized stream of it, compressed, flash-frozen, and ejected at high velocity directly into the patrol cruiser's forward sensor grid. The shields didn't even register it as a threat. Energy shields were designed to stop fast-moving objects, bullets, missiles, plasma bolts. They were not designed to stop slow, tumbling chunks of frozen organic waste. The material passed through the shield threshold at just under the activation speed, and then it hit the sensors. The exterior optical arrays, delicate and exposed by necessity, were coated in a thick, expanding layer of biological sludge. The heat from the ship's own engines began to thaw the material. It spread. Velnoth stared at his display as every external camera feed went dark, one by one, replaced by a brown, viscous smear. What is that? The science officer, a Kithera who prided herself on her encyclopedic knowledge of xenobiology, ran a spectral analysis. Her voice was barely a whisper. Fecal matter, primate origin, mixed with partially digested biomass, uric acid compounds, and trace amounts of methane. The bridge was silent. Then the smell hit. The atmospheric recyclers, designed to filter out toxins and pathogens, were not designed to handle the sheer volume of aromatic compounds now being vaporized by the ship's external heat. The vents began pumping the smell directly into the bridge. It was the smell of a zoo on the hottest day of summer, concentrated and weaponized. Velnoth's tendrils recoiled involuntarily. Seal the bridge! Override atmospheric intake! But it was too late. 3 crew members were already vomiting. The helmsman, a stoic Vryn who had survived boarding actions and hull breaches without flinching, abandoned his post and ran for the medical bay. On the human carrier, Kincaid watched the Council cruiser's formation collapse. The lead ship was drifting, blind and unresponsive. The 2 escort frigates, attempting to compensate, collided with each other at low speed, their shields flaring as automated systems tried to prevent a hull breach. Caesar's ship completed a barrel roll, pulled a tight arc, and returned to formation. He didn't fire a single shot. Kincaid turned to Thorne. Did we just win a battle with monkey shit? Thorne allowed himself a small, cold smile. We won a battle with a natural biological stress response, General. Completely unintentional, completely legal. They're going to call that a war crime. Let them. We'll argue it in court. Do you know how humiliating it will be for the Galactic Council to officially declare frozen primate feces a Class 5 bioweapon? They'll have to add it to the treaty, right next to nerve gas and antimatter warheads. The Council cruiser Harmonious Verdict limped out of the sector 3 hours later, its crew traumatized and its hull still reeking. The after-action report filed by Captain Velnoth was classified immediately, not because it contained military secrets, but because no one in the Ascendancy fleet wanted the rest of the galaxy to know they had been defeated by excrement. In his cockpit, Caesar groomed himself casually, picking at his flight suit. He didn't understand war. He didn't understand politics. But he understood territory, and he had just marked his. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened exactly 47 hours after the incident in Sector 7 Kappa. Ambassador Elias Thorne had been expecting the summons. What he hadn't expected was the speed. Normally, the Council moved with the glacial deliberation of a bureaucracy that had existed for 12,000 years. Emergency sessions required unanimous consent from all 7 member species. That meant someone was very, very angry. The Council chamber was an architectural marvel, designed to accommodate species with radically different environmental needs. The Ascendancy delegates sat in their climate-controlled pods, breathing their methane-rich atmosphere. The Kithera occupied the upper galleries, their crystalline bodies refracting the chamber's artificial light into geometric patterns. And at the center, elevated above all others, sat High Counselor Mir Hassan of the Luminous Accord. His species communicated through bioluminescent patterns across their translucent skin, which the chamber's translation matrix converted to audible speech. When Thorne entered, every Sweatovoy pattern in the room shifted to the crimson spectrum. Universal anger. Thorne walked to the defendant's platform, his boots clicking against the polished stone floor, and waited. Mir Hassan's voice, when it came through the speakers, was layered with harmonic overtones that made it sound like a choir of judgment. Ambassador Thorne, your presence has been requested to address charges of biological warfare in violation of the Treaty of Harmonious Coexistence, Section 12, Subsection 4, Paragraph 9. Thorne placed his tablet on the podium and clasped his hands behind his back. I'm aware of the charges, High Counselor. I've read the complaint, all 47 pages of it. Adrean Counselor, her optical implants glowing with barely contained fury, leaned forward. 47 pages were necessary to catalog the contamination protocols required to decontaminate the Harmonious Verdict. 3 crew members required psychological counseling. The ship's atmospheric recyclers had to be completely replaced. Do you comprehend the severity of what your pilots deployed? Thorne nodded slowly. I do, Counselor, and I sympathize with the crew's distress. However, I must respectfully point out a factual error in your complaint. Mir Hassan's bioluminescence flickered. Explain. The complaint refers to what your pilots deployed. That's inaccurate. My government deployed nothing. The sovereign pilots of the Pan-Troglodytes fleet experienced a natural biological stress response during a high-intensity encounter. The chamber erupted. The Cathera delegates chimed in discordant frequencies. The ascendancy representatives released pheromonal clouds that the translation matrix rendered as outraged profanity. A Vrin counselor, his chitinous plating rattling with indignation, activated his microphone. A stress response? Ambassador, your pilots deliberately vented biological waste at a military vessel. The telemetry shows intentional targeting of our sensor arrays. Thorne pulled up a holographic display from his tablet. With respect, Counselor, the telemetry shows no such thing. What it shows is a panic response from a pilot subjected to sudden, overwhelming sensory stimuli. Your cruiser's hailing protocols included 17 simultaneous audio frequencies, high-intensity spotlights, and active weapons locks. To a primate nervous system, that's not communication, that's a threat display. He advanced the hologram to show Caesar's biometric data during the encounter: heart rate, cortisol levels, adrenaline spikes. These readings indicate a fight-or-flight response. The pilot's autonomic nervous system triggered an involuntary evacuation of waste material. It's a documented defensive mechanism in stressed primates. Humans experience it too. We just have better sphincter control. The Drayan counselor's implants flared. Are you seriously arguing that your military deployment of biological contaminants was accidental? Thorne met her gaze without blinking. I'm arguing that it wasn't a weapon. It was a bowel movement, a very unfortunate, very large bowel movement that occurred during a moment of extreme physiological stress. He pulled up another document. I've prepared an amicus brief from Dr. Elias Thorne, humanity's leading primatologist. She's outlined the neurological and digestive processes involved in primate fear responses. I can submit it to the record if you'd like. Mir Hassan's patterns shifted to a deep purple, the color of incredulity. Ambassador, you are asking this council to accept that an entire fleet of military vessels is piloted by creatures so primitive, so uncontrolled, that they defecate when frightened? Thorne smiled. Yes, High Counselor, that's exactly what I'm asking you to accept, because it's the truth. You demanded we remove all artificial intelligence from our combat systems. We complied. What you're seeing now is the result. Biological pilots have biological limitations and biological reactions. A long silence filled the chamber. The Cathera counselor, whose species reproduced through crystalline budding and had no concept of waste elimination, spoke next. This is absurd. It's biology, Thorne countered. Then perhaps. The Cathera continued, her voice like wind chimes in a storm. Humanity should withdraw these pilots from active service if they cannot control their own bodies. Thorne shook his head. Can't do that, Counselor. They're not our pilots. They're sovereign citizens of an allied nation. We sold them the ships. We provide logistical support, but we don't command them. Resolution 909 was very clear on that point. Remember? You wrote it. The Vrin counselor slammed a manipulator appendage against his podium. Then we will classify this substance as a Class 5 corrosive biological agent and add it to the prohibited weapons list. Thorne's expression didn't change, but his eyes gleamed. You're welcome to do that, Counselor, but I should warn you that classification requires a formal vote and immediate treaty amendment, which means you'll need to define the substance in the official record. He paused for effect. So let me ask you this. Are you prepared to stand before the galactic community and officially declare that primate feces is now equivalent to antimatter warheads? Because that's going to be in every history book. Forever. The chamber went silent. Thorne could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. The Galactic Council prided itself on dignity, on elevated discourse, on being the enlightened arbiters of civilization, and he was forcing them to discuss shit. Mir Hassan's bioluminescence cycled through several colors before settling on a resigned amber. What is your proposed resolution, Ambassador? Thorne straightened. Simple. The Council acknowledges that the incident in Sector 7 Kappa was an unfortunate biological event, not an act of war. In exchange, humanity will implement additional waste management protocols on all Pan-Troglodytes vessels to prevent future contamination incidents. The Drayan counselor leaned forward. And what guarantee do we have that this won't happen again? Thorne allowed himself a small shrug. Counselor, I can guarantee better waste containment. I cannot guarantee that sovereign pilots won't experience stress responses in combat situations. That's the nature of biological entities. They're unpredictable, adaptive, difficult to counter with conventional tactics. He let that sink in. Which is precisely why they're so effective. The vote took 17 minutes. The resolution passed with significant dissent, but it passed. The Council would not classify the incident as biological warfare. They would, however, install organic dissolution grids on all military vessels within the next 6 cycles. Essentially, very expensive windshield wipers. As Thorne left the chamber, he passed Captain Velnoth in the corridor. The Ascendancy officer looked haggard, his ceremonial collar askew. They made eye contact for a brief moment. Velnoth's tendrils twitched. You know what the worst part is, Ambassador? Thorne stopped. What's that, Captain? We have to update our tactical databases. We have to add biological contamination to our threat assessment matrices. We have to train our crews to counter it. And every time we run those simulations, every time we brief new officers, we have to explain that we lost a battle because we were unprepared for excrement. Thorne's expression softened slightly. War is hell, Captain. War is humiliating, Velnoth corrected. He walked away, his posture defeated in a way that no weapon could have achieved. Back on the human carrier, General Kincaid was waiting in Thorne's private office. Well? Thorne poured himself a drink. We won. They're not classifying it as a war crime. They're calling it a biological incident. We've been ordered to implement better containment systems. Kincaid exhaled slowly. Thank God. Don't thank him yet, General. We just taught the Council that we're willing to weaponize anything, including biology. They're going to adapt. He took a sip. Which means we need to make sure our pilots adapt faster. In the primate habitat aboard the carrier, Caesar was being groomed by 2 subordinate chimps. He had no idea he'd just been the subject of a trial. He had no idea his bowel movement had nearly started an interspecies war. All he knew was that the strange ships with the bright lights had gone away. And that meant he'd won. A human technician entered the habitat to perform maintenance on the waste reclamation system. Caesar watched him with dark, intelligent eyes. The technician felt the weight of that gaze and worked faster. He didn't know why, but he suddenly felt like prey. The Ascendancy War Council met in a secure facility 3 jumps from the front lines. Fleet Admiral Keythron had summoned the brightest tactical minds in the Ascendancy, along with representatives from the other Council species. The topic was singular and urgent. How to counter the human primate fleet. The holographic display at the center of the chamber showed the current engagement statistics. 12 encounters, 7 Council defeats, 3 stalemates, 2 technical victories that resulted in such catastrophic morale damage they might as well have been losses. 0 casualties on the human side. Kethron's carapace plates shifted with agitation as he addressed the room. The organic dissolution grids are functioning as designed. The biological contamination issue has been neutralized, yet we continue to lose engagements. A Cathera strategic analyst, her crystalline form refracting the holographic light into sharp angles, chimed her response. The problem is not technological, Admiral. It is psychological. The primate pilots do not behave according to any known combat doctrine. They do not retreat when outgunned. They do not negotiate when cornered. They simply escalate. She pulled up footage from the most recent engagement. A single chimp-piloted fighter, heavily damaged in venting atmosphere, had accelerated directly into a Council destroyer's hangar bay and self-destructed. The explosion had been minimal. The panic it caused had been catastrophic. A Drayan intelligence officer spoke next, her voice tight with frustration. We've attempted to jam their communications. Standard protocol. We deployed quantum scramblers across all known human frequencies. She paused. It had no effect. They continued to coordinate as though our countermeasures didn't exist. Kethron leaned forward. How? The Drayan pulled up an audio file. Because they're not using technology. They're using this. She played the recording. The sound that filled the chamber was primal, layered, and deeply unsettling. It started as a low, rhythmic huffing. Then it built. Sharp barks, guttural screams, high-pitched hoots that climbed in frequency until they became almost ultrasonic. And beneath it all, a harmony. Not musical, but coordinated. Purposeful. The Cathara analyst's form flickered. What is that? Biological communication, the Drayan explained. Vocal calls, specific frequencies and patterns that convey tactical information, territory, threat assessment, attack coordination. It's not language as we understand it. It's instinct, refined instinct. A Vryn tactical officer, his mandibles clicking with disbelief, interrupted. You're telling me they're winning battles by screaming at each other? Yes, the Drayan said flatly. Kethron studied the waveform analysis on his personal display. Can we jam it? No, Admiral, it's analog, biological. There's no carrier signal to disrupt. We'd have to physically prevent them from producing sound, which would require breaching their hulls or boarding their ships. She didn't need to add that boarding a primate vessel had already been attempted. The recovery teams were still finding pieces of the assault squad. Kethron made a decision. Then we stop trying to jam them. We drown them out. Deploy active sonic countermeasures on all frequencies. If they want to scream, we'll scream louder. The order went out within the hour. 6 cycles later, the Council fleet encountered the primate forces near the mining outpost at Kepler 739. The Council had numerical superiority. 15 frigates, 3 cruisers, and a command carrier. The primate fleet numbered only 8 ships, but Caesar was leading them. On the bridge of the Council flagship Eternal Arbitration, Captain Sevlak felt confident. The new sonic countermeasure systems had been installed across the entire fleet. High-intensity broadband noise generators capable of drowning out any biological communication. When the primate ships entered range, Sevlak gave the order. Activate acoustic suppression. Full spectrum. The effect was immediate. Every external speaker array on the Council ships began broadcasting a wall of white noise, punctuated by randomized frequency spikes designed to disorient and confuse. It was loud enough to rattle the teeth of any biological entity within 100 kilometers. Sevlak watched his display with satisfaction as the primate ships hesitated, their formation loosening. Maintain suppression. All ships, advance in standard formation. Prepare to. Then he heard it. Not through the external sensors, through the hull itself. A sound so deep, so penetrating, that it bypassed his audio receptors entirely and resonated directly in his chest cavity. The primate fleet wasn't trying to communicate through the jamming. They were using it as an amplifier. Caesar's cockpit camera showed him gripping his control columns with all 4 limbs, his mouth open in a scream that didn't stop. Behind him, 11 other pilots were doing the same. The sound they were producing was beyond volume. It was beyond frequency. It was weaponized fury transmitted through every piece of vibrating metal in their ships. The Council's sonic countermeasures designed to project outward were creating a resonance chamber, and the primates were feeding into it. On the Eternal Arbitration, the crew was experiencing something no amount of training had prepared them for. The ship's hull was vibrating at frequencies that made their inner ears malfunction. The Drayan crew members, with their delicate optical implants, began experiencing visual hallucinations as the vibrations disrupted their neural interfaces. The ascendancy officers, whose sense of balance relied on fluid-filled chambers in their heads, lost all spatial orientation. Sevlak gripped his command chair, fighting the overwhelming urge to vomit. "Shut it down! Shut down the acoustic systems!" The engineering officer tried, but the primate fleet had moved closer, and their biological broadcasting was now strong enough to trigger feedback loops in the Council's own equipment. Every speaker, every comm array, every external sensor that could produce sound was now amplifying the scream. A Cathara officer, her crystalline structure literally cracking under the sustained vibration, abandoned her post. The helmsman, tears streaming from his eyes, was frantically trying to input a retreat vector while his hands shook uncontrollably. And then the primates stopped screaming. The silence was so sudden, so complete, that it felt like a physical blow. For 3 seconds, the Council crews gasped in relief. Then the primate ships opened fire, not with elaborate tactics, not with precision targeting, just pure, overwhelming aggression at point-blank range. The Council formation, already in disarray, collapsed entirely. Ships collided. Weapons fire went wide. Automated systems, their sensors still recovering from the acoustic assault, failed to distinguish friend from foe. The eternal arbitration took 3 direct hits to its starboard side, not from primate weapons, but from its own escort frigate. Sevlak, his head still pounding, managed to croak out a single order. Retreat! All ships, retreat! The after-action report was 300 pages long. Most of it was medical documentation. 47% of Council crew members involved in the engagement reported persistent tinnitus. 18% required psychiatric evaluation for audio-related trauma. 6% had suffered permanent damage to their equilibrium organs and would never serve on a ship again. And buried in the technical appendices was a note from the Council's chief acoustic engineer. It read, "The primate vocalizations produced harmonic frequencies that human researchers have documented for centuries. They are called pant hoots and are used in territorial displays. However, when amplified through ship-mounted speaker arrays and synchronized across multiple vessels, they create a resonance pattern that mimics the natural fear response frequency in 73% of known sapient species. In essence, the primates discovered how to broadcast pure terror directly into our nervous systems. Countermeasures unknown." In the council chambers, the emergency session was quieter this time, more resigned. Ambassador Thorne stood at the defendant's platform once again, though this time no formal charges had been filed. This was an informal consultation. High Counselor Mir Hassan's bioluminescence was a tired gray. "Ambassador, your pilots have now weaponized sound itself." Thorne nodded. "They have, High Counselor. Though I should point out once again that these are sovereign pilots operating under their own tactical judgment." The Drayan counselor, her implants dimmed to minimal brightness, leaned forward. "We activated acoustic countermeasures, standard jamming protocols. Somehow, your pilots turned our own systems against us." Thorne pulled up a holographic display. "That's because you tried to jam biological communication with technological solutions. Primates have been coordinating attacks through vocalization for millions of years. They don't need radio. They don't need encryption. They just need lungs and aggression." He advanced to the next slide, which showed a waveform analysis. "What your engineers encountered is called a chorus effect. When multiple primates vocalize simultaneously, they instinctively synchronize to amplify their territorial display. It's not strategy, it's evolution. They're literally hardwired to do this." The Cathera counselor's chime was almost mournful. "So, there is no counter?" Thorne tilted his head thoughtfully. "Well, you could try not using speaker systems in combat. Go completely silent. No hails, no warnings, no countermeasures." He paused. "Of course, that violates about 15 different sections of the Treaty of Harmonious Coexistence regarding proper engagement protocols." Mir Hassan's patterns flared briefly with anger, then dimmed to resignation. "You've trapped us again." "Not me, High Counselor. The rules. You wanted a galaxy governed by law and procedure. We're just following the procedures." Loudly. As Thorne left the chamber, he activated his secure comm to General Kincaid. "How's Caesar?" Kincaid's voice was weary. "Still screaming. He's been doing it for 3 hours straight. I think he likes the echo in the hangar bay." "Let him scream, General. Apparently it's our new strategic deterrent." "Thorne, we need to talk about escalation. The Council is going to adapt eventually. And when they do, General, we'll adapt faster. That's what humans do. That's what our pilots do. We find the gap and we exploit it." He disconnected and walked through the station corridor, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Behind him, faint and distant through the station's hull, he could hear it. The sound of Caesar, still screaming, still claiming his territory, still winning. Commander Thalrix of the Vryn Enforcement Corps had boarded 47 hostile vessels in his career. He had breached pirate strongholds, cleared infested stations, and led assault teams into active war zones. He had never lost a soldier under his command. That record was about to end. The mission brief had been straightforward. A single primate transport vessel, designation Fist of Darwin, had been disabled during a skirmish near the freight lanes of Sigma Draconis. Engine dead. Life support minimal. Communications offline. According to Ascendancy Intelligence, The ship carried 12 primate pilots and minimal human support staff. The Council wanted prisoners, live specimens for study, behavioral analysis, anything that might reveal a tactical weakness. Thalrix had objected. His species had evolved as ambush predators on a high-gravity world. They understood the value of overwhelming force applied from concealment. Boarding a damaged ship full of cornered predators violated every instinct he had. But orders were orders. His assault team consisted of 20 Vrin shock troops, the best the Enforcement Corps had to offer. Each wore fully sealed combat armor rated for vacuum, biological hazards, and kinetic impacts up to 50 calibers. Each carried plasma rifles with non-lethal stun settings and lethal backups. They had rehearsed the breach 40 times in simulation. It should have been simple. The docking clamp sealed with a mechanical thunk that reverberated through both hulls. Thalrix checked his squad's vitals on his HUD. All green. Breach in 3, 2, 1. Execute. The cutting torch activated, burning through the Fist of Darwin's outer airlock in a perfect circular cut. The door fell inward with a clang that echoed in the artificial gravity of the boarding tube. Thalrix's point team moved in, rifles raised, scanning for targets. The airlock chamber was empty, dark, and completely silent. The smell hit them first. Even through the armor's atmospheric filters, the biological signature was overwhelming. Sweat. Musk. Something sharp and organic that made Thalrix's olfactory receptors recoil. Forward. Standard sweep pattern. Watch for ambush. The team moved deeper into the ship. The corridors were narrow, designed for human proportions, which meant Thalrix and his soldiers had to move single file. Their armor scraped against the walls. Every light in the ship was off except for the emergency strips along the floor, casting everything in a dim red glow. Thalrix's helmet sensors registered movement ahead. Contact 20 meters, multiple signatures. He raised his rifle. The first chimp appeared at the edge of his targeting reticle. It was hanging from the ceiling, not floating. Hanging. Thalrix's brain took a moment to process what he was seeing. The ship had no artificial gravity in this section. The corridors were 0G, and the primate was clinging to the ceiling structure with its feet, staring at him with dark, calculating eyes. Target acquired. Preparing to... The chimp dropped, not fell, dropped. It released its grip and launched itself directly at the lead soldier, using a handrail to redirect its trajectory mid-flight. The Vrin trooper fired, but the stun bolt passed through empty space where the target had been a split second earlier. The chimp collided with the soldier at chest height, all 4 limbs wrapping around the armored torso. Then it bit. The armor held, but the force of the impact sent both of them tumbling backward into the soldier behind them. And then the corridor exploded with motion. Chimps came from everywhere, from access panels, from ventilation shafts, from side corridors that hadn't registered on the scanner sweep. There were more than 12, far more. Thalrix realized with cold horror that the initial count had been wrong. The ship wasn't carrying 12 pilots. It was carrying 12 pilots and their entire support troop. Juveniles, subadults, bonobos, 40 primates in total, all of them moving in 3 dimensions simultaneously. The Vrin were trained for ground combat, horizontal and vertical planes, predictable physics, but in 0G, against opponents with 4 prehensile limbs and millions of years of arboreal evolution, they were helpless. A bonobo female used the ceiling to launch herself at a soldier's helmet, her hands finding the seams in his armor with horrifying precision. She didn't have the strength to breach it, but she didn't need to. She just covered his faceplate with her body, blinding him completely. The soldier panicked, spinning and firing randomly. His plasma rifle discharged into the wall, then into another soldier's leg. Thalrix tried to establish fire lanes, but his troops were too tightly packed in the narrow corridor. Every shot risked hitting friendly forces. A juvenile chimp, no more than 40 kilograms, grabbed a soldier's rifle barrel and used it as a swing point, redirecting his entire body mass into a kick that shattered the soldier's helmet seal. The Vrin gasped as his atmosphere vented, then went limp as his suit's emergency protocols kicked in. Alive, but unconscious. A liability. Thalrix made the call. Fall back. Tactical retreat to the breach point. But falling back in 0G was not a simple maneuver. The Vrin had to use handrails and magnetic boots to pull themselves backward while maintaining weapon discipline. The primates had no such limitations. They bounded off walls, ceiling, and floor with equal ease, using the Vrin themselves as launch points. Caesar, the Alpha, had been watching from the far end of the corridor. He had not moved. He had simply observed as his troop dismantled the assault team with pure chaotic efficiency. Now he moved. He pushed off from a wall strut with all four limbs, accelerating through the 0G corridor like a biological missile. His target was Thalrix. The commander saw him coming and fired. The stun bolt caught Caesar's center mass. It should have incapacitated him instantly. Instead, Caesar's muscles locked in mid-flight, his limbs rigid and extended. But his momentum didn't stop. He collided with Thalrix like a battering ram, driving the commander backward into the airlock chamber. They tumbled together, Caesar's paralyzed limbs still wrapped around Thalrix's armor, his teeth bared inches from the commander's faceplate. Thalrix could see the intelligence in those eyes, the calculation, the rage. And then, the stun effect wore off. Caesar's hands found the emergency release on Thalrix's helmet. The commander managed to grab Caesar's wrist before he could trigger it, and for a moment they simply struggled in the 0G void, rotating slowly. Thalrix had superior strength. Caesar had four limbs. The chimp's feet found the commander's chest plate and pushed, using Thalrix's own grip as an anchor point to generate rotational force. They spun faster. Caesar released one hand and grabbed a passing handhold, arresting his spin while Thalrix continued tumbling. By the time the commander stabilized himself, Caesar was already gone, disappearing back into the ship's dark corridors. The final count was devastating. 14 Vrin soldiers injured, 3 with severe trauma requiring medical evacuation, 0 primate casualties, 0 prisoners taken. The assault team had retreated after 18 minutes of engagement, leaving behind 2 rifles, multiple pieces of equipment, and their entire tactical reputation. Thalrix sat in the debriefing room, his armor scorched and dented, and tried to explain what had happened. The Ascendancy observer, a career military analyst who had never seen direct combat, kept interrupting. You had numerical parity, superior equipment, and tactical surprise. How did you fail to secure even a single target? Thalrix's mandibles clicked slowly, a sign of deep frustration in his species, because we were fighting in their environment, not ours. He pulled up the helmet camera footage. The observer watched in silence as the recording showed the chaotic three-dimensional combat, the primates moving with a fluidity that seemed to defy physics. They don't think in terms of floors and ceilings, Thalrix explained. To them, every surface is the ground. Every angle is an attack vector. They're not bipedal in 0G. They're something else. The observer made a note on his datapad. Recommendation? Thalrix stood, his armor servos whining. Don't board their ships, ever. If you disable a primate vessel, leave it disabled and move on. If you try to breach, you're not conducting a boarding action. You're entering a three-dimensional ambush predator's hunting ground. He paused at the door. We think of them as monkeys, as primitive. But in 0G, they're not the primitives. We are. The footage from the engagement was classified immediately, not for tactical reasons, but because the Galactic Council's propaganda division realized that if the member species saw what the primates were capable of in close quarters, recruitment for assault teams would cease entirely. No one wanted to fight an enemy that could use your own environment against you. No one wanted to face an opponent with 4 hands and no fear. On the Fist of Darwin, the human engineering crew finally got the engines back online. They found the chimp pilots and their support troop in the main cargo bay, grooming each other and hooting softly. Caesar was in the center, surrounded by his troop, accepting submission gestures from the younger males. The lead engineer, a woman named Santos, approached cautiously. Caesar, you okay? The alpha chimp looked at her with those dark, intelligent eyes. He didn't vocalize. He simply held up his hand. In his palm was a small piece of technology, a Vrin helmet camera, ripped from a soldier's armor during the fight. Santos took it carefully. Did you take this on purpose? Caesar's expression didn't change, but his lips pulled back slightly, showing teeth, not a threat display, a smile. Santos felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the ship's failing life support. The primates weren't just fighting instinctively anymore. They were learning. They were adapting. And they were starting to understand what the equipment did. She pocketed the camera and backed away slowly. Later, in her personal log, she would write, "Caesar took a trophy today, not for dominance, not for food. He took it because he wanted to understand how we see him." The moment a predator becomes curious about its prey's perspective is the moment it stops being just a predator. It becomes something more dangerous. It becomes strategic. The log was flagged by human intelligence 3 days later. By then, it was too late to matter. The primates had crossed a threshold. They were no longer just pilots following human commands. They were soldiers learning human tactics. And somewhere in the back of every human officer's mind, a small voice was beginning to ask a very uncomfortable question. What happens when they learn enough? Fleet Admiral Kethron stood before the assembled War Council with something he had not felt in 3 decades of military service: desperation. The holographic tactical display showed the current strategic situation. The primate fleet, now numbering 23 vessels, had established a defensive perimeter around 3 contested mining systems. Council forces outnumbered them 4-1. Council ships had superior firepower, better shields, and more experienced crews. And yet they were losing. Not quickly, not dramatically, but consistently, humiliatingly, and without any clear path to victory. Adrian, strategic analyst, presented the latest engagement data. In the past 42 cycles, we have initiated 17 separate actions against primate forces. Our win-loss ratio is 0.23. We have suffered 68% crew casualty rates from non-lethal causes. Morale is at critical levels across all combat divisions. She paused. "Admiral, our forces are afraid." Kethron's carapace plates shifted. "Then we end this. Now. We commit overwhelming force and crush them in a single decisive engagement." He gestured to the display. "The primate fleet is currently holding position at Kepler 442. They're defending a mining station that supplies 70% of their raw materials. If we take it, we cut their logistics chain. They'll have to withdraw or starve." The Kythera military observer chimed softly. "And if they don't withdraw, then we destroy them," Kethron said flatly. He pulled up the battle plan. "I'm committing the absolute unity, full dreadnought class, 12 escort cruisers, 40 frigate-class support vessels. We jump in, establish a blockade, and give them one opportunity to surrender." A Vryn tactical officer, one of the few who had survived the boarding action on the Fist of Darwin, spoke quietly. "They won't surrender, Admiral. Then they die." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken doubt. But no one countermanded the order. The absolute unity entered the Kepler 442 system exactly on schedule. 300,000 tons of military engineering, bristling with weapons arrays and shielded by energy fields that could withstand direct hits from antimatter warheads. It was the Council's most advanced warship, a symbol of their technological and cultural superiority. Captain Zelmoth, commanding from the primary bridge, watched his tactical display with grim satisfaction as his fleet emerged from jump. The primate vessels were exactly where intelligence had predicted, 23 ships in a loose defensive formation around the mining station, outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. Zelmoth opened a priority channel to Ambassador Thorne, who was observing from a diplomatic vessel at the edge of the system. "Ambassador, your allies are surrounded. We are prepared to accept their immediate and unconditional surrender. This is their only opportunity to avoid total destruction." Thorne's face appeared on the comm screen, his expression unreadable. "Captain, I appreciate the courtesy of the notification. However, as I've explained repeatedly, these are sovereign pilots. I don't command them. You'll need to address your terms directly to them." Zelmoth suppressed his irritation. "Very well. Establish a visual channel to their command vessel." The communications officer worked quickly. After a moment, the screen flickered. What appeared was not a bridge, not a tactical center. It was a cockpit. Caesar sat in his flight harness, surrounded by the cramped controls of his fighter. Behind him, visible through the canopy, were the other primate ships holding position. And Caesar was smiling. His lips were pulled back, exposing his teeth in a wide, unmistakable expression. Several of the bridge officers visibly relaxed. The drained communications specialist actually smiled back. "Captain, I believe they're signaling submission. That's a pacification gesture in most species." Zelmoth studied the image carefully. Something felt wrong. "Ambassador Thorne, is that a surrender?" Thorne's voice came through quietly. "Captain, I strongly suggest you do not lower your shields." "Explain." "Because that's not a smile. Not to a primate." On the screen, Caesar's expression hadn't changed. His teeth were still bared, his eyes locked on the camera. "In primate body language," Thorne continued, "baring teeth is a threat display. It's what they do right before they attack. When a chimp shows you his teeth like that, he's not being friendly. He's telling you he's about to rip your throat out." Zelmoth felt his blood cool. Then why is his entire fleet doing it? On the tactical display, every primate ship had begun broadcasting visual feeds. Every cockpit showed the same thing: chimps and bonobos, all of them smiling, all of them staring directly at the Council fleet with bared teeth and dark, calculating eyes. "Because," Thorne said quietly, "they're coordinating. The bonobo commanders positioned in the support vessels were the key. While the chimps flew the fighters with aggressive, instinctive brilliance, the bonobos coordinated timing with a precision that seemed almost telepathic. They didn't use verbal commands. They used facial expressions, body language, and a complex series of vocalizations that the Council's translation matrix couldn't parse. The smile wasn't communication between the primates and the Council. It was communication between the primates themselves, a synchronized signal. Zelmoth realized what was about to happen a split second before it did. "All ships, raise shields to maximum. Evasive." But he was interrupted by his tactical officer. "Captain, the mining station. It's powering up." On the display, the station's massive cargo accelerators, normally used to launch refined ore to transport ships, were rotating, repositioning, targeting the Council fleet. Zelmoth's eyes widened. "Those are cargo launchers. They can't possibly—" The station fired. Not weapons, not missiles. Raw ore. Thousands of tons of it, packed into cargo containers and accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed. The trajectory was imprecise, the targeting crude. But when you're throwing that much mass, precision doesn't matter. The Council escort frigates, positioned to intercept any fighter attack, were completely unprepared for a ballistic bombardment from a stationary industrial facility. 2 frigates were hit directly, their shields overloading from the sheer kinetic energy. A third took a glancing blow that sent it spinning out of formation. And in that moment of chaos, the primate fleet moved. Caesar's fighter led the charge, but he wasn't heading for the dreadnought. He was heading for the gap in the escort screen that the cargo bombardment had just created. The bonobos had calculated it perfectly. The smile had been the signal. The station bombardment was the distraction, and the real attack was aimed at the Absolute Unity's command escorts. The 6 smallest primate fighters, piloted by the most aggressive chimps, broke formation and accelerated directly at the Council cruisers protecting the dreadnought's flanks. Zelmoth watched in horror as the primate ships closed distance faster than his point defense could track. "All batteries, fire! Concentrate on—" One of the primate fighters exploded as it took a direct plasma hit. The second lost shields but kept coming, venting atmosphere and trailing debris. The third made it through. The chimp pilot, a young male called Brutus by the human handlers, didn't try to ram the cruiser. Instead, at the last possible moment, he fired every weapon his ship had directly into the cruiser's shield generator array at point-blank range. The shields collapsed, and before the backup generators could engage, Caesar's main attack wing hit the exposed cruiser with concentrated fire. The cruiser didn't explode. It simply went dark, its systems offline, drifting. The Absolute Unity's defensive formation was compromised. Zelmoth made the only decision he could. All ships, execute tactical withdrawal, maintain firing solutions, but establish distance. As the Council fleet began its retreat, Caesar's fighter pulled a tight arc and returned to formation. His cockpit camera was still broadcasting. He was still smiling. But now, every Council officer who saw that smile understood exactly what it meant. The engagement lasted 23 minutes. The Council lost 4 frigates, 2 cruisers, and the Absolute Unity's forward weapon batteries were damaged by a lucky shot from the mining station's cargo launchers. The primate fleet lost 3 fighters. The pilots were recovered by human search and rescue teams. 2 survived with injuries. 1 did not. But Caesar lived, and as his fleet regrouped around the mining station, every human observer noted the same thing. The primates weren't celebrating their victory. They were studying the wreckage, analyzing what had worked, learning. In the Galactic Council chambers, emergency session number 47 was called to address the disaster at Kepler 442. High Counselor Mir Hassan's bioluminescence was a deep, angry crimson. Ambassador Thorne, your allies have humiliated our fleet. They used industrial equipment as a weapon. They used deceptive body language to create tactical openings. This is beyond acceptable combat doctrine. Thorne stood at the defendant's platform, his posture as calm as ever. High Counselor, the mining station is a civilian facility operated by an independent corporation. It defended itself using available resources. As for the body language, he pulled up a document. I have here a communication sent to your diplomatic corps 3 cycles ago. It's a primer on primate behavior, specifically addressing threat displays and appeasement gestures. It was written by Dr. Elias Thorne and submitted as educational material. He let that sink in. You were warned. You chose not to listen. The Drayan counselor's implants flared. They smiled at us. They made us think they were surrendering. Thorne nodded slowly. Yes, they did. And your forces interpreted that smile according to your own cultural framework. That's not deception, Counselor. That's a failure of intelligence. The smile is a threat display in primates. It always has been. If you send your fleet to fight an enemy whose body language you don't understand, the consequences are on you. Mir Hassan's patterns cycled through several colors before settling on a resigned gray. What do you want, Ambassador? The same thing I've always wanted, High Counselor, for you to accept reality. These pilots are effective because they're unpredictable. They're dangerous because they don't think like you. And they're winning because you keep trying to fight them using your rules instead of adapting to theirs. He closed his tablet. Stop trying to board their ships. Stop trying to intimidate them. And for the love of whatever you consider sacred, stop assuming you understand what their gestures mean. The council session adjourned with no resolution, no treaty, no agreement. Just a growing, uncomfortable awareness that the galaxy had changed. On the carrier Prometheus, General Kincaid found Ambassador Thorne in the observation deck, staring at the primate habitat below. Caesar was visible through the reinforced transparasteel, grooming one of the younger chimps. We lost Grendel today, Kincaid said quietly, referring to the pilot who hadn't survived the recovery. Thorne nodded. I know. Caesar doesn't seem bothered by it. He is. You're just not seeing it the way he expresses it. Kincaid joined him at the window. They're getting smarter, using the mining station as artillery, coordinating feints and real attacks. That's not instinct anymore, Thorne. That's tactics. I know. So what happens when they don't need us to win battles? What happens when they realize they can do this themselves? Thorne was quiet for a long moment. Then we have a problem, General, because we created them to be smart enough to fight our wars. And now they're learning to fight their own. Below, Caesar finished grooming the younger chimp and looked up. His eyes met Thorne's through the transparasteel. And for just a moment, Thorne could have sworn the chimp understood exactly what they were discussing. Caesar's lips pulled back. The smile, the threat, the promise of things to come. The victory celebration in the officers' mess aboard the carrier Prometheus lasted exactly 47 minutes before General Kincaid noticed something was wrong. The battle at Kepler 442 had been a decisive tactical success. The Council fleet had retreated with significant losses. Human casualties were minimal. The primate pilots had performed flawlessly. And yet, as Kincaid stood at the observation window overlooking the flight deck, watching the recovered fighters being serviced, he felt a growing sense of unease. Ambassador Thorne joined him, holding a glass of something expensive that he wasn't drinking. You feel it too, Thorne said quietly. Feel what? The silence. Kincaid frowned and activated his tactical earpiece, cycling through the standard primate communication channels. Normally, after a successful engagement, the habitat would be chaos. Hooting, screaming, dominance displays, social grooming. The sounds of primates celebrating a successful hunt. Instead, there was nothing. Just the low hum of life support and the occasional rustle of movement. Maybe they're tired, Kincaid offered. They're never tired after a win, General. They're energized. This is something else. Dr. Elias Thorne's voice cut through their secure channel. We have a problem in Habitat 3. You both need to see this. They found her in the observation gallery above the main primate enclosure. Below, 32 chimps and bonobos were gathered in a formation that made Kincaid's military training scream warnings. They weren't clustered randomly or organized by social hierarchy. They were arranged in tactical groupings. Chimps on the outside, bonobos in the center. Defensive positions with clear sight lines to all entrances. And in the center of it all was Caesar. He wasn't displaying aggression. He wasn't vocalizing. He was simply sitting, surrounded by his troop, watching the observation window with dark, calculating eyes. How long have they been like this? Thorne asked. 3 hours, Dr. Elias replied, since the moment we recovered the last fighter. They returned to quarters, assumed this formation, and haven't moved. Kincaid studied the arrangement. That's a defensive perimeter. Military standard. How the hell do they know? Because they've been watching us, General. For months. Every briefing, every tactical display, every formation we run. They've been learning. Ambassador Thorne leaned closer to the transparasteel. What are they defending against? Dr. Elias pulled up a datapad. That's what concerns me. After every previous battle, we run standard post-combat protocols, medical evaluation, equipment debrief, and most importantly, the reward phase. She highlighted a schedule on her screen. Caesar and his pilots receive high-value rewards after successful engagements. Enhanced food, social time, entertainment enrichment. It's fundamental to the conditioning program. And I sent the standard notification 30 minutes ago. Informed them the reward phase would begin in 1 hour. She paused. Caesar accessed the habitat's communication terminal and sent a response. Kincaid blinked. He what? Dr. Elias played the recording. It was text-to-speech, the robotic voice reading words that Caesar had painstakingly typed, using the simplified keyboard interface designed for primate use. Reward, not required. The 3 humans stared at the screen in silence. Run that again, Thorne said quietly. Dr. Elias complied. Reward, not required. Kincaid felt his stomach drop. That's 4 words. He's never strung together more than 2 before. He's never needed to, Dr. Elias said. The conditioning program is based on immediate reward for desired behavior. If he's refusing rewards, the entire behavioral framework collapses. Ambassador Thorne straightened. He's not refusing rewards, Doctor. He's refusing the transaction. He's telling us he doesn't fight for bananas anymore. Then what does he fight for? Below, Caesar stood. The movement was deliberate, controlled. Every primate in the habitat immediately shifted to face him. He walked to the habitat's main terminal, the one with the video feed to Earth Command. With careful, practiced movements, he activated it. The screen flickered to life, showing the Earth Command bridge where Fleet Coordinator Martinez was overseeing the post-battle logistics. Martinez smiled when he saw Caesar's face appear. Caesar, outstanding work today, truly exceptional. We're authorizing double rations and... Caesar reached out with one long finger and pressed a button. The video feed cut to black. Martinez's voice came through, confused. Caesar? Caesar, are you there? We're experiencing a technical... Caesar pressed another button. The audio feed went silent. In the observation gallery, the 3 humans watched as Caesar turned away from the terminal and returned to the center of his troop. He sat down, folded his arms, and waited. Get a technical team down there, Kincaid ordered. I want that feed restored immediately. General, Dr. Elias said carefully. That wasn't a malfunction. He knew exactly which buttons to press. He's been watching the handlers use that terminal for months. Then override it. Use the emergency command channel. Already tried. He's disabled it from his end. Ambassador Thorne's expression was carefully neutral. General, I don't think forcing communication is the right approach here. He's cut off Earth Command. He's refusing orders. He's not refusing orders. He hasn't received any orders. He's simply stopped listening. Kincaid turned to face Thorne directly. What exactly are you suggesting, Ambassador? I'm suggesting we're witnessing the inevitable conclusion of our own success. We uplifted these primates. We gave them intelligence, tactical training, and military capability. We taught them to coordinate, to strategize, to win. And now they've learned the most dangerous lesson of all, which is that they don't need us. The emergency staff meeting convened in the secure briefing room 20 minutes later. Captain Rivera, the carrier's commanding officer, pulled up the tactical display. Current status. All primate pilots have returned to their habitats and assumed defensive positions. They are not responding to communication. They are not engaging with handlers. They have disabled all remote monitoring equipment in their quarters. She paused. As of 1600 hours, we have effectively lost command and control over our entire pilot roster. A logistics officer spoke up. Can we force compliance? Lock down the habitats, restrict food delivery, activate the emergency restraint protocols? Dr. Aris shook her head. The emergency protocols are designed for individual containment. If we activate them against the entire population simultaneously, we risk triggering a panic response. And a panicked chimp with military training is not something I want to deal with in an enclosed habitat. What about the shock collars? Another officer suggested. The room went silent. Everyone turned to look at Ambassador Thorne. He remained perfectly still for a long moment, then pulled up a document on his tablet. The behavioral compliance protocols were patched out 6 weeks ago. Kincaid's face went pale. Patched out? On whose authority? Mine, Thorne said calmly. I authorized a mandatory firmware update that disabled the proximity triggers. The Galactic Council was pressuring us about humane treatment of sovereign species. The shock collars were classified as torture devices under their revised humanitarian standards. I had them removed to maintain our legal position. You didn't think to inform the military command? I informed the appropriate channels. The memo was distributed 3 weeks ago. Captain Rivera pulled up her message logs, scanned quickly, and swore under her breath. It was tagged as low-priority administrative paperwork. I never saw it. Thorne closed his tablet. Then we have a communications failure on multiple levels, which, ironically, is exactly what we're experiencing with Caesar right now. General Kincaid leaned heavily on the briefing table. Options. I need options. We could wait them out, Captain Rivera suggested. They still need food, water, air. Eventually, they'll have to engage. Or, Dr. Aris countered, they'll realize they can access those resources themselves. The habitats have emergency supply stores designed for 3-week autonomy, and Caesar has demonstrated he understands how to operate computer terminals. Ambassador Thorne stood. I have a suggestion. Go ahead. We stop treating this as a disciplinary problem and start treating it as a negotiation. Kincaid's expression hardened. We don't negotiate with our own assets. They're not assets, General. They're sovereign allies. Remember, that's the entire legal framework we built to protect ourselves from council prosecution. We've been telling the galaxy for months that these pilots are independent actors. Maybe it's time we actually treated them that way. And say what exactly? Ask them nicely to please keep fighting our battles? No, Thorne said quietly. We ask them what they want. The silence that followed was broken by Captain Rivera. That's insane. Is it? We negotiate with every other sovereign power in the galaxy. Why not them? Because they're primates. Uplifted primates, enhanced intelligence, military training, legal personhood. General, we made them smart enough to fly warships and win battles. We just didn't expect them to be smart enough to ask questions. Dr. Aris was studying her tablet, her expression troubled. There's another factor we need to consider. Caesar isn't just refusing rewards. He's organizing collective action. Every primate in the fleet has synchronized their behavior. That's not instinct. That's leadership. Sophisticated leadership. She looked up. He's not just smart. He's politically aware. Kincaid rubbed his temples. Fine. Ambassador, You want to negotiate? Go negotiate. But I want human security teams on standby. And I want remote destruct codes ready for every primate-piloted ship in this fleet. Already activated, Captain Rivera confirmed. If this goes wrong, we can disable the entire fighter wing remotely. Thorne walked to the door, then paused. General, one more thing. The destruct codes you're relying on, they were installed by the same engineers who designed the habitat terminals that Caesar just figured out how to disable. He left before Kincaid could respond. Ambassador Thorne approached Habitat 3 alone. No security escort, no weapons, just a tablet and a communication earpiece. Caesar was waiting at the transperistyle barrier, his posture relaxed, but his eyes alert. Thorne activated the Habitat's external speaker system. Caesar, we need to talk. The chimp didn't respond verbally, but he moved closer to the barrier. Close enough that Thorne could see the intelligence in those dark eyes. The awareness. Thorne sat down on the floor, putting himself at Caesar's eye level. I know you understand more than you let on. I know you've been watching us, learning from us, and I know you're smart enough to realize that what happened today was different. Caesar tilted his head slightly. Thorne pulled up an image on his tablet. It showed the battle at Kepler 442, the Council fleet. The victory. You won, again. You've won every engagement. You've done everything we asked, and more. He advanced to the next image. The flight deck. The fighters being refueled and rearmed. But you're not celebrating. You're not asking for rewards. You're organized, defensive, waiting. He looked directly at Caesar. So I'm asking, what do you want? For a long moment, there was silence. Then Caesar moved to the Habitat's terminal. His fingers, slower and less precise than human hands, but infinitely more capable than they had been 6 months ago, typed carefully. The text-to-speech activated. Why we fight. Thorne felt something cold settle in his chest. It was a simple question, 3 words. And it was the one question he had been dreading since the moment they created the first uplifted primate. You fight because the Council is our enemy. Because they're trying to destroy human civilization. Caesar's fingers moved again. Not our enemy. Thorne exhaled slowly. No, they're not. You're right. They're humanity's enemy, not yours. Caesar stared at him through the transperistyle, waiting. Thorne made a decision that would change everything. What do you want, Caesar, in exchange for continuing to fight? What would make this worth it for you? The chimp's response was immediate, as though he'd been waiting for exactly this question. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, faster than Thorne had ever seen. The text appeared on the screen. Fleet, ours, ships, ours, we, fly, where, we, choose. And there it was. The moment Ambassador Elias Thorne realized that humanity's greatest weapon had just demanded its independence. He looked at Caesar for a long moment, then activated his secure channel to General Kincaid. General, we have a problem. What kind of problem? The kind where our pilots just went on strike, and they're not asking for better bananas. In the command center, alarms began blaring as the first reports came in. Every primate-piloted ship in the fleet had just locked out its human support crews. The engines were still running. The weapons were still armed. But the control systems would only respond to primate biometrics. Caesar hadn't staged a rebellion. He'd staged a coup. And he'd done it so smoothly, so quietly, that by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already over. General Kincaid stared at his tactical display in disbelief as red warning indicators spread across every ship designation. How? How did they coordinate this? Dr. Aris pulled up the communication logs. They didn't use our systems. They used theirs. Vocalizations, body language, signals we've been hearing for months and assumed were just noise. She looked up, her expression a mixture of horror and admiration. General, they've been planning this since the moment we taught them how to win. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was called with unprecedented speed. 48 hours after the engagement at Kepler 442, every member species had convened in the Grand Chamber. The holographic evidence displays floated above the assembly floor, showing footage that had been classified by 3 separate council intelligence agencies before being leaked by an unknown source. The Screech Protocol, the Brown Nebula incident, the Zero-G massacre aboard the boarding teams, the Smile Trap. Every humiliating defeat, every psychological weapon, every violation of what the Council considered civilized warfare, displayed in brutal clarity. High Counselor Mir Hassan's bioluminescence pulsed a deep, furious crimson. Ambassador Elias Thorne stood at the defendant's platform, flanked by 2 human legal advisors and looking considerably less relaxed than usual. General Kincaid watched from the observer's gallery, his expression carefully neutral. This was the moment they had been building toward since the first primate pilot strapped into a cockpit. The legal trap was about to spring. Mir Hassan's voice resonated through the chamber's translation matrix. Ambassador Thorne, the evidence before this council is irrefutable. Your forces have engaged in biological warfare, psychological torture, deceptive combat practices, and deliberate violations of the harmonious combat accords. A Dreyan prosecutor, her optical implants displaying case files directly onto her retinas, stepped forward. Specifically, we charge humanity with the following violations. Article 12, subsection 4, deployment of biological agents in combat. Article 19, use of acoustic weapons designed to cause permanent neurological damage. Article 27, deliberate targeting of crew psychological stability. Article 41, use of deceptive surrender protocols. She paused for effect. The combined penalty for these violations, under Council law, is total economic embargo, military occupation of all human colony worlds, and potential glassing of Earth itself. The chamber was silent. Thorne let the moment hang, then spoke quietly. May I respond? Mir Hassan's patterns flickered. You may. Thorne pulled up his own holographic display. High Counselor, honored members of the Council, I want to begin by acknowledging the severity of the charges. The incidents documented here are disturbing, traumatic, and I understand completely why the Council feels violated. He paused. However, there is a fundamental legal problem with these charges. The Dreyan prosecutor's implants flared. Which is? Jurisdiction. Thorne advanced his display to show a document. Resolution 909, the treaty that banned artificial intelligence in military applications, included very specific language about sovereign species and their independent military forces, language that this council drafted and approved unanimously. He highlighted a section. Specifically, Section 7, Paragraph 12 states, each sovereign species maintains absolute authority over its military forces and tactics, provided said forces are composed of biological entities capable of independent decision-making. The Cathera observer chimed sharply. We are aware of the treaty language, Ambassador. It does not grant immunity from war crimes. You're absolutely correct, Thorne agreed. It doesn't grant immunity. It grants jurisdiction. And according to that same treaty, war crimes committed by a sovereign species can only be prosecuted by that species' own government. He pulled up another document. I present to you the formal government charter of the sovereign nation of Pan-Troglodytes, recognized by this very council 8 months ago as a prerequisite for their pilots to be considered legal combatants rather than weapon systems. The chamber erupted in confused chatter. Mir Hassan's patterns cycled rapidly through several colors before settling on an ominous purple. Ambassador, are you seriously arguing that Earth cannot be held responsible for the actions of the primate pilots? I'm not arguing it, High Counselor. I'm stating it as legal fact. The primate pilots are citizens of an independent sovereign nation. They operate their own military vessels under their own command structure. Earth provides logistical support. Yes, we sold them the ships, yes, but we do not command them. He gestured to the evidence displays. Every action documented in these charges was committed by sovereign primate military forces acting under their own authority. If the Council wishes to prosecute war crimes, you must bring charges against the Pan-Troglodytes government, not against humanity. The Dreyan prosecutor stepped forward, her voice sharp with anger. This is absurd. The primates cannot govern themselves. They are uplifted animals operating under human direction. Thorne's expression hardened. Counselor, I would be very careful with that line of argument. Are you suggesting that an uplifted species cannot possess true sovereignty? Because if you are, you've just invalidated the legal status of 3 council member species whose evolutionary history includes genetic engineering by precursor civilizations. He pulled up historical records. The Luminous Accord were uplifted by the progenitors 12,000 years ago. The Vryn were genetically modified by the architects. The Draen themselves carry genetic markers consistent with deliberate enhancement. Are you arguing that your own species lacks sovereignty because you were once modified by another? The chamber fell silent. The legal trap had just become visible. The Cathara observer chimed again, more carefully this time. The difference, Ambassador, is that those uplift events occurred millennia ago. The species in question have demonstrated sustained independence and self-governance. Your primates have existed as a sovereign entity for less than a standard year. Thorne nodded. A fair point. So let's examine the criteria for sovereignty as defined by this council. He pulled up another document. According to council law, a species demonstrates sovereignty through 4 key factors. 1. Independent decision-making capability. 2. Establishment of governmental structures. 3. Capacity for diplomatic relations. 4. Demonstrated ability to defend territorial claims. He advanced through each point methodically. Independent decision-making. The primate pilots have repeatedly made tactical decisions without human input, often overriding human recommendations. Check. Governmental structures. The Pan-Troglodytes nation has a recognized hierarchy, established social laws, and documented chain of command. Check. Diplomatic relations. They've established communications protocols with human support staff and, as we've recently learned, have begun refusing orders they consider unjust. That's not obedience. That's negotiation. Check. He paused on the final point. Ability to defend territorial claims? High Counselor, they've defeated your fleets in 17 consecutive engagements. I'd say that's pretty definitive. Check. General Kincaid, watching from the gallery, felt a cold admiration for Thorne's performance. This was why they'd chosen him. The man could argue that water was dry and make it sound reasonable. A Vryn counselor, his carapace plates clicking with agitation, spoke up. Even if we accept your argument about sovereignty, Ambassador, you cannot deny that Earth created these pilots specifically to circumvent Resolution 909. You engineered a loophole. We did, Thorne admitted freely. We absolutely did. And it was completely legal. Resolution 909 banned synthetic intelligence and prohibited the creation of new life forms for military purposes. We didn't create new life. We restored an extinct species and enhanced them using genetic techniques that are, I might add, less invasive than the standard medical treatments used by 6 council species. He pulled up genetic comparison data. The modifications made to pan-troglodytes are comparable to the enhancement protocols the Ascendancy uses on their own military officers. We just started with a different baseline biology. The Draen prosecutor made one final attempt. Ambassador Thorne, this entire argument is built on a technicality. Everyone in this chamber knows that the primate forces act at humanity's direction. You created them. You trained them. You deploy them. The sovereignty claim is a legal fiction. Thorne smiled coldly. Counselor, all sovereignty is a legal fiction. The borders between your systems are lines on a map that only exist because everyone agrees to pretend they exist. The authority of this council only exists because its member species agree to recognize it. Legal fictions are the foundation of civilization. He gestured broadly at the chamber. We created a legal fiction called the Sovereign Nation of Pan-Troglodytes. You recognized it. You granted it legitimacy. You incorporated it into your treaties and protocols. And now you're discovering that legal fictions, once recognized, have consequences. Mir Hassan's bioluminescence had faded to a resigned gray. So you're telling this council that we have no recourse. That humanity can unleash biological weapons, psychological warfare, and tactical deception without consequence, simply because you've wrapped those weapons in a sovereignty claim. I'm telling you that if you want to prosecute war crimes, you need to bring charges against the government that committed them, which legally is not Earth. And who governs the Pan-Troglodytes nation? Thorne paused. This was the moment where the careful legal architecture could collapse. Their alpha, Caesar. He leads their military forces and serves as their primary decision-maker. And where is Caesar now? Currently in orbit around Kepler 442, aboard the carrier Prometheus. Under human supervision? As a sovereign ally stationed at a joint operations facility, yes. The Dreyan prosecutor seized on this. Then we demand Caesar be brought before this council to answer for the war crimes committed by his forces. Thorne's expression didn't change, but General Kincaid saw the slight tension in his shoulders. This was the dangerous part. I can relay that request to the pan-troglodytes government. However, I should warn you that recent developments have made our diplomatic relationship with them somewhat complicated. Explain. Thorne pulled up a recent incident report. 48 hours ago, the primate pilots enacted what appears to be a military work stoppage. They've locked human personnel out of their vessels, ceased responding to tactical directives, and effectively asserted complete operational independence. The chamber erupted. Mir Hassan's voice cut through the chaos. Are you telling this council that you've lost control of your own military assets? They were never our military assets, High Counselor. That's been my entire argument. They're a sovereign ally. And like any ally, they have the right to withdraw from joint operations if they choose. This is madness. This is sovereignty, Thorne countered. You demanded we remove AI from our combat systems. We complied by using biological pilots. You demanded those pilots be legally recognized as persons rather than property. We complied by granting them sovereignty. Now you're discovering that sovereign persons can make their own decisions, including decisions you don't like. A long silence filled the chamber. Finally, the Kythera observer spoke, her chime carrying a note of weary resignation. Ambassador Thorne, what exactly is your proposal? Simple. The Council acknowledges that the Pan-Troglodytes nation is a sovereign entity responsible for its own military actions. You draft a treaty directly with them, not with Earth, establishing rules of engagement that both sides can accept. And you stop trying to hold humanity accountable for the decisions made by an independent government. And if we refuse? Thorne's expression was carefully neutral. Then you'll need to decide whether you want to declare war on an independent sovereign nation, which I should point out has proven remarkably effective at defeating your fleets. And if you do declare war on them, Earth will be forced to honor our mutual defense treaty and come to their aid. He let that sink in. You'll be fighting both of us, legally and militarily. The vote took 3 hours. The resolution passed with significant opposition, but it passed. The Galactic Council officially recognized that war crimes charges against primate forces must be directed at the Pan-Troglodytes government, not at humanity. A diplomatic envoy would be dispatched to negotiate rules of engagement directly with primate leadership. And Earth was formally censured for reckless uplift practices, but faced no material penalties. As Thorne left the chamber, he found General Kincaid waiting in the corridor. You just got us off the hook for everything, Kincaid said quietly. I bought us time, Thorne corrected, but the clock is ticking, General. What do you mean? The Council is going to send diplomats to negotiate with Caesar, and Caesar is currently refusing to talk to us, let alone them. If he decides to tell them that he was following human orders the whole time, this entire legal structure collapses. Kincaid's expression darkened. You think he would? I think Caesar is smart enough to understand leverage, and right now he has all of it. He can cooperate with us and maintain our legal fiction, or he can expose us and watch the Council glass Earth while he flies away in ships we can't reclaim. They walked in silence for a moment. So what do we do? Kincaid asked. We do what we should have done from the beginning, General. We negotiate with Caesar on his terms, because he's not our weapon anymore. Thorne stopped at the window overlooking the docking bay where his shuttle waited. He's our problem. Back on the Prometheus, Caesar sat in his habitat, surrounded by his troop. The human handlers had tried 3 more times to establish communication. He had ignored them all. But he was watching the news feeds. The text-to-speech function read the Council's decision aloud in its flat, mechanical voice. Caesar listened carefully. When it finished, he turned to the terminal and typed slowly. They blame us. The words appeared on the screen. One of the younger chimps, Brutus, hooted a question. Caesar's lips pulled back in something that could have been anger or amusement. He typed again. Good. Because Caesar understood something that most of the humans still didn't. If they were going to blame him for the war crimes, then he might as well own them. And if he owned them, he owned the fleet. And if he owned the fleet, he didn't need Earth's permission anymore. He just needed to decide where to go next. The recall order went out at 0600 hours, Galactic Standard Time. General Kincaid stood in the primary command center of Earth Defense Station Alpha, surrounded by tactical displays showing the disposition of every human military asset in known space. The war with the Council had effectively ended. The diplomatic fallout from Chapter 16 had created an uneasy ceasefire, and now it was time to bring the primate pilots home. Captain Rivera stood at the communications console, her fingers hovering over the recall activation sequence. General, all ships are in position to receive the command. Human support crews have been evacuated from primate vessels as per protocol. We're ready to initiate remote shutdown and autopilot return to Earth orbit. Kincaid nodded. Execute recall. Authorization Kincaid 77 Alpha. Rivera entered the command string. On the display, 23 ship identifiers began flashing green as the recall signal propagated through the quantum communication network. Then, one by one, they turned red. Access denied. Rivera's hands moved quickly across the console, running diagnostics. That's not possible. The recall codes are hardwired into the navigation systems. They can't be overridden without... She stopped. Sir, the biometric locks have been changed. Every ship in the primate fleet just re-registered its primary command authority. To what? To primate biometrics only. The ships won't accept human command codes anymore. Kincaid felt ice in his veins. Override them. Use the emergency master keys. Trying now. The display flickered. Override rejected. Command authority, Pan-Troglodyte's sovereign fleet. Ambassador Thorne's voice came through the secure channel. General, I'm seeing the same thing from the diplomatic vessel. Caesar isn't just refusing orders. He's locked us out of the entire fleet. How? Those systems require human engineering teams to access. You can't just reprogram a warship's command structure from a cockpit terminal. Dr. Elias Thorne's voice joined the channel, tight with a mixture of fear and scientific fascination. Actually, General, you can, if you understand the underlying logic of the system, and if you've been watching human engineers perform maintenance operations for 8 months. She pulled up security footage. This is from the Fist of Darwin 3 weeks ago. Watch the bonobo in the background. The video showed a standard maintenance cycle. A human engineer accessing the ship's core systems, running diagnostics, entering command codes. And in the corner of the frame, barely visible, a bonobo sat at an observation terminal, watching, recording every keystroke with perfect visual memory. Bonobos have demonstrated the ability to memorize complex sequences after a single observation, Dr. Aris explained. We knew they were smart. We underestimated how observant they were. Kincaid pulled up the tactical display showing the primate fleet's current position. They were holding formation near Kepler 442, exactly where they'd been when the recall order was issued. Not advancing, not retreating, just waiting. Open a channel. Visual. Direct to Caesar's ship. The communications officer worked quickly. After a moment, the main display flickered to show Caesar's cockpit. The alpha chimp sat in his flight harness, his dark eyes fixed on the camera with an expression that was disturbingly close to human patience. Behind him, through the canopy, the other primate ships maintained perfect formation. Kincaid leaned toward the camera. Caesar, this is General Kincaid. The war is over. It's time to come home. We need you to release command authority and initiate return protocols. Caesar didn't respond verbally. Instead, he reached for his terminal and typed with deliberate slowness. The text-to-speech function activated. No. Just one word. Kincaid felt his jaw tighten. Caesar, those ships belong to Earth. They were built with human resources, designed by human engineers and paid for by human taxpayers. You need to return them, now. Caesar's fingers moved across the keyboard again. Read. Contract. Ambassador Thorne's voice cut in urgently. General, what contract is he referring to? Kincaid pulled up the legal database, searching for any agreement signed between Earth and the Pan-Troglodytes government. There were dozens of documents, logistics agreements, medical protocols, habitat specifications, and buried in the middle of the stack, a document that had been drafted 9 months ago and approved by a committee that no longer existed, the Sovereign Defense Equipment Act. Dr. Aris found it first and read aloud, her voice going progressively quieter as she reached the critical section. Section 4, Paragraph 7. All military equipment assigned to sovereign pilots for the defense of their personhood and territorial rights shall be considered the property of said sovereign entity, transferable upon completion of joint defense operations. Silence filled the command center. Captain Rivera spoke first. That's the treaty Thorne used to prove the primates were independent actors. We needed them to legally own their equipment so the Council couldn't claim they were just human weapons. But we never intended, Kincaid started. It doesn't matter what we intended, Thorne interrupted. It matters what we wrote. And what we wrote is that equipment assigned to sovereign pilots becomes their property. We did it to protect ourselves legally. We just gave Caesar the entire fleet. Kincaid turned back to the display. Caesar, that treaty was meant to protect you, to give you legal status, not to... Caesar typed again, faster this time. You made us, people, own things. The logic was simple, brutal, and completely irrefutable. Kincaid tried a different approach. What do you want, Caesar? What will it take for you to return the ships? Caesar's response was immediate. Nothing. Nothing? You don't want anything? The alpha chimp's lips pulled back in that now familiar expression. The smile that meant something very different from friendliness. He typed again. We keep fleet. We fly. Where? We choose. No more orders. Ambassador Thorne's face appeared in a smaller window on the display. Caesar, if you leave with those ships, Earth can't protect you. The Council will hunt you. They'll call you pirates, rebels. They'll kill you. Caesar's eyes shifted to Thorne's image. His fingers moved slowly, deliberately. You taught us. Win. And there it was. The final lesson humanity had taught their perfect soldiers. How to survive against superior odds. How to exploit legal loopholes. How to win. Dr. Aris was reading through more documents, her face pale. There's more. The Mutual Defense Treaty we signed with the Pan-Troglodytes nation. Section 9 states that if either party withdraws from the alliance, all jointly held assets revert to their original sovereign ownership. She looked up. The moment Caesar declares independence, the treaty is void, and since the ships are registered as Pan-Troglodyte sovereign property, they're his, legally, completely. General Kincaid felt the enormity of what was happening settle over him. They hadn't just lost a fleet. They'd created a new spacefaring power, one that understood human tactics, human technology, and human law well enough to beat them at their own game. He tried one final approach. Caesar, please. Without those ships, Earth is vulnerable. The Council might honor the ceasefire now, but what happens in a year? 5 years? We need those assets for our own defense. Caesar's response came quickly. Not our problem. Kincaid felt anger flash through him. We created you. We gave you intelligence, training, purpose. You owe us. The moment the words left his mouth, he knew it was a mistake. Caesar's expression changed. Not to anger, not to fear, to something colder. He typed slowly, each word appearing with deliberate weight. You made us smart enough to fight, forgot, make us loyal enough to stay. He paused, then added one final line. Thank you for lesson. The communication channel went dark. On the tactical display, the primate fleet began to move. Not toward Earth. Not toward Council space. They aligned their vectors toward an unexplored sector. a region of unclaimed systems that human surveys had designated as low priority. Systems with habitable planets, systems with resources, systems with fruit trees. Captain Rivera's voice was barely a whisper. "Sir, should we activate the remote destruct codes?" Every eye in the command center turned to Kincaid. The general stared at the display, watching hundreds of billions of dollars in military hardware preparing to jump away. Ships that Earth desperately needed. Ships that had been built to protect humanity. Ships that were now leaving forever. His hand hovered over the destruct authorization panel. One code, one command. He could destroy the entire fleet remotely. Caesar would never see it coming. Except that would be murder. Murder of legally recognized sovereign citizens. Murder of allies who had fought and bled for Earth. Murder of intelligent beings who had done nothing wrong except take humanity at its word. Ambassador Thorne's voice came through quietly. "General, if you activate those codes, you prove that everything the Council said about us was true, that we never saw them as people, that the sovereignty was always a lie, that we're willing to commit genocide to maintain control of our weapons." Kincaid's hand remained frozen. "And if I don't? Then we let them go. We live with the consequences of our own cleverness, and maybe, just maybe, we earn something more valuable than a fleet. Which is the knowledge that when we created life, we created it free." The silence in the command center was absolute. Then, slowly, General Kincaid lowered his hand. "All ships, stand down. Do not activate destruct codes. Do not pursue. Let them go." On the display, the primate fleet's engines flared bright blue. One by one, the ships entered jump space. Caesar's fighter was the last to leave. Before he jumped, he sent one final transmission. Not text, not speech, just audio. The sound of primate vocalizations, layered and harmonized. Hoots, barks, and screams that the translation matrix tried and failed to parse. But the humans who had worked with the primates for months understood it instinctively. It was a farewell call, a territorial declaration, a promise. Then Caesar's ship vanished into jump space, and the display went dark. Dr. Eris sat down heavily, her tablet forgotten in her lap. "We created them to be smart enough to fight our wars. We just forgot that meant they'd be smart enough to want freedom." Ambassador Thorne stood at the observation window, watching the empty space where the fleet had been. "Humanity, fuck yeah," he said quietly, with no trace of triumph in his voice. "What?" Captain Rivera asked. "That's what the stories always say, isn't it? That humanity's greatest strength is our ability to find a way, to exploit loopholes, to win against impossible odds. We taught them everything we know about being human." He turned back to face the command center. "We just forgot that being human means wanting to be free." General Kincaid pulled up a report on his tablet, already dreading the conversation he'd have to have with Earth Command. "What do we tell the Council?" Thorne considered for a moment. "The truth. That our allies exercised their sovereign right to withdraw from the alliance. That they left peacefully and with no hostile actions. That they're no longer our responsibility. They're going to ask where Caesar went. And we're going to say we don't know, because we don't, and because even if we did, we wouldn't have the authority to tell them. Sovereign nations don't owe explanations for their internal movements." Kincaid almost smiled. "You really did create the perfect loophole, didn't you? I created a legal framework that treated them as people. They just took me seriously." 3 weeks later, the first reports came in. A previously unclaimed system in Sector 12 Gamma had been occupied by unknown forces. Preliminary scans showed extensive construction activity, habitat domes, agricultural facilities, defensive installations, and ships. 23 ships in orbital patrol, flying formations that were unmistakably primate in their aggressive, unpredictable efficiency. The Galactic Council sent a diplomatic envoy. The envoy's ship was hailed with a simple text message. "Pan, troglodytes, sovereign, territory, leave, or fight." The envoy left. When the report reached the council chambers, High Counselor Mir Hassan's bioluminescence cycled through every color in his species' emotional spectrum before settling on resigned amber. So, humanity gave the galaxy a new power. Ambassador Thorne, attending via hologram, nodded. We gave the galaxy a new sovereign nation. What they choose to do with that sovereignty is up to them. And if they become a threat, then you'll deal with them the same way you deal with any sovereign power. Through diplomacy, trade negotiations, and, if necessary, war. But they're not humanity's responsibility anymore. Are you not concerned about what you've created? Thorne was quiet for a long moment. Every parent worries about what their children will become, High Counselor. We just have to hope we taught them well. On the bridge of his flagship, in orbit around a planet the bonobos had named in their own complex language, Caesar sat in his command chair. It was modified from a human design, adapted for primate physiology, but unmistakably the seat of authority. Around him, his troop was organizing their new civilization. Bonobos managing logistics and diplomacy. Chimps training the next generation of pilots. Juveniles learning to read, to write, to operate technology. A young female approached, carrying a data pad. She had learned to use the text-to-speech function and spoke haltingly through it. Ships. Ready. Where? We. Go. Next. Caesar looked at the tactical display showing the unexplored sectors beyond their new home. Territory, resources, freedom. Everything they'd fought for. Everything humanity had accidentally given them. He typed his response. Anywhere, we choose. Because that was the final lesson, the one humanity had learned too late. When you create something smart enough to fight, make sure it's loyal enough to stay, or brave enough to let it go. In his quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel returning to Earth, Ambassador Thorne sat alone, nursing a drink he wasn't tasting. On his personal tablet was a final message, sent through an encrypted channel he'd given Caesar months ago, just in case. The message was simple. Thank you for teaching us how to be free. We will. Remember, humanity taught us well. Thorne raised his glass toward the viewport, toward the distant stars where Caesar's fleet had vanished. Humanity. Fuck yeah, he whispered. Because in the end, humanity's greatest achievement wasn't defeating the Galactic Council. It wasn't building the perfect weapon. It wasn't exploiting the loopholes. It was creating life that was strong enough, smart enough, and brave enough to choose its own path. Even if that path led away from its creators. Even if it meant losing everything they'd built. Even if it meant learning that the best thing you can do for something you've created is let it go. The fleet was gone. The war was over. And somewhere in unexplored space, a new civilization was being born. One that would remember where it came from. One that would carry humanity's lessons forward. One that would tell its children about the strange, clever species that had given them life, intelligence, and freedom. And then, impossibly, had let them keep it. That was the story the galaxy would remember. Not the battles. Not the legal victories. Not the clever loopholes. Just the moment when humanity proved that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let go. Humanity. Fuck yeah.